All right, good morning. So, as you heard in the introductions, my name is Josh Raylet. I'm with Rudman Winchell. Been practicing law for about 10 years now, and I've been at Rudman Winchell for about 5. I do employment law, and that consists, for me, in my practice, a mix of a few different things. On the front end, things like this, providing trainings to employers and giving personnel HR advice to people. So when employers have a question, hey, this issue popped up and I don't know how to handle it, or I've got this going on with an employee, I don't know what to do, I'm there along with my colleagues to pick up the phone and kind of talk you through the process to hopefully avoid problems before they really escalate to become a big problem. On the back end, I also do employment-related litigation. So if it gets to the point of somebody's filing a discrimination charge or a lawsuit in court, I work on those as well. So I practice a lot before the Maine Human Rights Commission, which is an administrative body down in Augusta, as well as state and federal courts here in Maine. So that's just a little bit about me. In terms of my talk right now, I hope for it to be somewhat of an interactive process. So if at any time you guys have questions or comments or whatever you want to share, feel free to put your hand up and shout out, and we'll engage you that way. Hopefully it's not just going to be me talking at you for the whole time. But I'm going to start with, as Frank said, the very beginning of the employment relationship, which is when you are interviewing somebody, making the decision to make an offer and onboard them. And then we'll go from there into the middle of the life cycle, managing, and then to the end of the termination. So you're getting ready to bring somebody on for a position. I thought it made sense to start talking about job descriptions. Because before you hire somebody for a position, perhaps you ought to know what they're going to be doing. And you can typically find that in a job description. So what are they and why do they matter? Well, a job description is typically a plain language tool that explains the tasks, the duties, the function, and responsibilities of the position. And why do they matter? Well, they matter for a few different reasons. One being, they tell the applicant what they're going to be doing and what you expect of them in order to succeed in this position. So they're coming in with eyes wide open. And they're not surprised 3 months into their job that, hey, I didn't even know I was supposed to be doing A, B, and C. So it lets them know what you expect. It also serves as a basis for you to judge their performance against them. So when you later get to the point of a review, you have some objective criteria there to say, okay, this is your job description. How have you actually been performing your job, and are you meeting these criteria or not? So it gives some backbone to a review so that you have some guideposts to talk about and evaluate during that evaluation. And this is another important one. Job descriptions help to define what we call the essential functions of the job. And that's kind of a legal term of art, but essentially what that means is the basic functions that a person will be doing in a position that they need to be able to do to accomplish what this job is here for. And why does that matter? Well, that becomes particularly important when you're dealing with requests for reasonable accommodation under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Maine Human Rights Act. If somebody has a disability and they're a qualified individual for a job, you might have to make accommodations so that they can perform the essential functions of their job. How do you know what the essential functions of their job are? Well, hopefully you can find those in the job description. It makes that process a little bit easier for you. So that's kind of why they're important. What should a job description contain? This is all fairly basic stuff. Probably have it down, but sometimes I find it's good to go over the basics just to make sure. Obviously, you want to have a title. You want to know what the title is or what the position is that you're hiring for. You should have a pay grade or a range. You might go by ranges like the state of Maine does. You should have that on there so somebody knows, okay, this is what I can expect if I'm successful, and be somewhere in this range. You should have the hours and shifts that the job is expected to work, or the schedule, or if it's variable, that should be written in there as well so that people kind of know what they're getting into. A summary of the job, you're going to be working as plow driver, And then follow that up with the essential functions of the job, like we said, so that they know these are all the things that I really have to be able to do to succeed here.
How specific does that have to be?
Specific enough so that if nothing else, if they do all of those things that you list, you'll be happy. You can add to it, you can supplement it, but if nothing else, if they can at least check off whatever criteria you've got there, you're satisfied that they're doing what they need to do to make that position what you envision it to be.
Let me just add, you also want to have something like, and other duties as assigned.
Yeah.
So it's
Okay.
not, it's not.
You-
it's not
So I was gonna say,
like-
how about whatever we want?
You
Whatever
always,
we ask.
you always leave that magic word there that says
Yeah.
other duties as assigned,
All right.
so that you can give yourself leeway to say, I need you to go sweep the floor over there.
All right.
And then the person doesn't say, wait a minute, that's sweeping the floor isn't in my job description.
Right.
Well, I need you to do it, and it says other duties as assigned.
Yeah. Okay.
So essential functions of the job are important to kind of figure out so that you can put those in the job description. And that begs the question, how do you figure out what the essential functions are? The U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Office, the EEOC, they've published some guidance on this. They're the ones that really enforce the Americans with Disabilities Act, and they have regulations and rules to kind of guide people on this is how we envision it ought to work, and this is how we construe the meaning of the phrase essential functions of the job. So these are their guideposts. It's not necessarily the end-all be-all, but if you can stick to this, these are some pretty good ideas.
How do you define reasonable under that, like a reasonable accommodations under the American Disabilities Act?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
We'll get there, yeah.
Sorry.
That's going to be in phase 2, which is managing the employee. So figuring out what are actually the essential functions of the job. One question is, does this position exist to accomplish this task? So if you're a custodian, you exist to take care of the grounds and maintenance, that type of thing. That's the core function. So that's one question. Another question to think through is how much time is this person going to spend doing this task? If they're going to spend 1% of their time doing it, then probably that's not essential. But if they're going to be spending 75% or 50% even, or some substantial amount of their time doing X, then that clues you in, and that's probably an essential function of the job. A related question is, what are the consequences of this position not doing this task? So if we excuse this task from this position, what's going to happen? Is everything going to fall apart? Are we going to have to shuffle things around and find somebody else or some other position to do that? What are we going to lose by not having this position do X? Relatedly, how many other employees are available to do this thing? If you don't really have any other options, then that's probably essential for that position. If you've got 100 other people that can do something, then maybe it's not essential for that position. So that's something that you want to look at. You want to look at the degree of skill required for the task. That kind of goes along with the last one that I just said. If it's something that really requires some specialized skill or knowledge or training that this position is going to have and nobody else, that's probably essential for this job. If it's something that anybody, if they have 10 minutes, can pick up and do, then maybe that's not essential. So that's something that plays into the calculus. You also want to spend a little bit of time talking to the people, if it's a current position, the people who are actually working in that job, or the people that have recently held that job. What are your experiences? What do you do on a daily or a weekly basis? What do you do a lot of? What do you not do so much? And that can clue you into what's essential and what's not essential. And then lastly, if you're dealing with a position that might be part of a bargaining unit, you want to check the CBA, the collective bargaining agreement, because that might speak to this. So you just want to check that out before you finalize that process. Also, within the job description, you want to, this goes along with the essential functions to an extent, you want to include the exertional requirements for the job. So you're going to have to be able to lift 50 pounds regularly, or you're going to have to be able to stand for extended periods of time, or lots of walking, whatever it is physically that this position is going to need to be able to do. you should include that within the description. Again, number one, so people are on the same page when they sign on, they know what they're getting into. But also, if you ever find yourself in the position of having to work through the interactive process for a reasonable accommodation request, you know kind of what physically is expected of this person, and is lifting 100 pounds really essential for this job, or is it not? Well, let's check the job description, what's in there. It'll give you at least a starting point to start that discussion. Any questions about job descriptions before we move on? Yes?
In the job of firefighting, those descriptors might be a little tough to define where it's such an unknown. How do we combat that within the job description?
Do you have like annual fitness standards or something that people have to be able to comply with? Or
We have an entry physical standard,
okay.
but not a continuing annual physical standard. Not defined by either weight or necessity for physical exertion.
Sure.
As you can imagine, that is a pretty broad spectrum that we have to.
Yeah. I'll give my thoughts. I'll also open it up to the panel and see if they have any counter thoughts. But I would say make it clear that you need to be able to engage in vigorous physical activity when required, and that might include lifting heavy things, carrying people, carrying equipment, getting in and out of buildings. Perhaps you don't need to make it specific about it's going to be 50 pounds or it's going to be running into a building once a week
Just
or anything like
describe
that. But describe the nature of the activities that you might be expected to do on a moment's notice.
Yeah, just be straightforward, just say,
Yep.
if it's a job that has varying responsibilities and requirements, you know, one day you could be sitting in the office, and the next day you could be running up and down burning stairs, and
Yeah.
people will understand that.
Yeah.
The other thing I would add is that this description can include semi-psychological aspects too. If dealing with the public in a polite and respectful and effective manner is necessary, if multitasking and handling 3 or 4 things at a time because it's a busy environment, you're under pressure, and you've got to work as a team, you can and should indicate those things. You might have an applicant who has autism or who has some disability that only lets them do one thing at a time. And that will work for some jobs, but it won't work for every job. And for those that it wouldn't work for, or that require interpersonal skill and diplomacy and tact when people come in and they're mad about something and you have to handle them on behalf of the city, you want to put that in the description so that you can point to the person and say, look, this is what you were hired for.
That was very diplomatic.
That was. I was going to say, if they're going to be the face of your organization dealing with the public and they're not a people person, then that should be a red flag right off the bat, and that's why you have it in the description. But Frank put it much better than I did. Yes?
Could that wording be, in case our perspective, rescue-like activities, or do we actually have to spell out worst-case scenario to lightest-case scenario?
I don't think you have to give A to Z. You have to say it in concept enough that you can go back and point to it and say, well, you know, whether it's carrying air packs or, you know, fighting fires using standard state-of-the-art technology, which may change, you know, if they make the hoses lighter or heavier, that's what they're going to have to do.
Okay.
But they're going to have to use state-of-the-art skill. So you can do that in generalities. It doesn't have to be the great American novel.
Okay.
Josh,
Yes.
once you put down the essential functions on your, on the job description, is that going to bind the Maine Human Rights Commission?
No. So if you get to the point of having a Maine human rights complaint or a lawsuit in court where somebody has filed a lawsuit or a claim based on discrimination and based on not getting an accommodation, the commission and the courts will look at the job description to see what the essential functions of the job are listed in there. And they will look at that and take that into consideration, but that's not the end-all, be-all of the analysis. They will also talk or take testimony from the plaintiff, perhaps other people who have worked in that job, to find out, okay, it's nice to know what's on the paper, but tell me in the real-world scenario, what did you actually do? And they'll try to figure out if that differs from what's on paper at all. And if it does differ, then those additional functions may be essential functions of the job, or there may be certain things on the paper that the judge or the commission determines really isn't an essential function of the job. So it's a good starting point, but it's not the end-all, be-all. which is another reason why periodically you ought to review your job descriptions for your positions. I think annually is sufficient. You could do it more often than that if you wanted to. You don't need to. You could stretch it out longer if you wanted to, but I think annually is a good benchmark. And just go through it and look at everything and see, is this still relevant? Is this still accurate for what people are actually doing in this position? Talk to people, talk to employees, have them look at it. And if the first 2 items really we don't do anymore, maybe you can modify that and take those off. Maybe 3 new things need to be added on. But it's something that should be looked at and thought about on a periodic basis so that it's still relevant and current.
The other thing that I didn't mention before is like environmental conditions. People have to work in the cold, they have to work in heat, they have to work around dust or smoke, that kind of stuff. Think about listing those things.
And that also becomes very helpful if you do have a workers' compensation claim. And once you go through that process, at some point, hopefully, the employee will be ready to come back to work. And then you could use that to send it off to a doctor to review and say, is this person now released to perform these functions?
Yeah, a good description can be very helpful when you are in the interactive process, which somebody will talk about later. When you're dealing with a physician or a nurse practitioner or whatever medical provider a person may be seeing treatment from, to say, okay, this is what they're going to need to do. Here's a nice little piece of paper with what this person's going to be expected to do. Can they do it? And are there any modifications that they might need to be able to do this? But at least you have some sort of structure to give the medical provider to operate under instead of just saying, they're a public works employee, figure it out. Can they do it? You're giving them a little bit of meat to work with. So, you've got a great job description. Now you're ready to advertise and fill the position. So I want to talk a little bit about applications and interviews. I don't want to say that a lot of this stuff is common sense, but I'm going to say it because a lot of this stuff is common sense. There are a couple of technical traps for the unwary that I'll highlight, but a lot of it comes down to common sense. The technical traps really relate to a couple of changes that the Maine legislature made in September of last year. These are laws that became effective September 19 of 2019. One relates to Social Security numbers, one relates to pay history. So for Social Security numbers, the law is you cannot ask for an applicant's Social Security number until they've got a conditional offer of employment. So check your application forms. If you're using an old form that says, please put your SSN here, you're going to want to take that off. Same thing in your interviews. It would be a really odd interview question, but don't say, hey, by the way, what's your Social Security number? Because you can't do it until you give them a conditional offer of employment. There are a couple of caveats to that. I don't expect any of those will really apply to you. For instance, if you are working on a federal contract where the federal government requires that you get this information right off the bat, then there's a safeguard for that. But by and large, Social Security numbers are a no-no at the application and interview stage. The other recent change from September of last year is wage history. And this is one that is often on applications. So check your applications and make sure that there is no box on there that says, how much did you make at your last job? What are you currently making? What did you make at your last 5 jobs? Whatever the case may be. Take that off. And don't ask that sort of information at the interview. This law basically says an employer cannot ask an applicant for their wage history unless and until they've been given a conditional offer of employment that includes all aspects of compensation. So at the application stage, interview stage, can't touch it. If somebody volunteers that information to you, you're not going to get in trouble for it, but you can't solicit that information. And people think it's kind of an odd law, but here's the reason for it. It's aimed at pay discrimination. And so historically, the thought process is that women have been paid less than men for the same jobs. And by asking for pay histories, that pattern can be perpetuated into the future, even if it's not intentional. So in other words, if I have 2 applicants for a position and one happens to be a woman who tells me she's been doing this for 5 years, making $13 an hour, and another one is a man who tells me he's been doing it for 17 hours for 5 years, then maybe I offer the woman 14 because I know that it's still a raise from what she's been making. That's what this is intended to avoid, so that everybody starts with a level playing field, and hopefully that pay equalizes itself between the genders. So that's kind of the rationale behind the law. Yes.
So that would be important reason for putting it in the description, the pay area.
The pay grade, the pay
Yeah, so
parameters.
you're getting interested folks and don't have to broach that conversation.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about how to phrase certain questions in an interview in just a second. But yes, that's a good reason for putting it in the description or in the posting for the ad. This is the pay range or the pay grade, so that people kind of know what to expect. And like I said, if you're sitting in an interview and somebody says, hey, by the way, I want you to know I made $42,000 a year at my last job, don't panic. You're not going to be brought right down to the MHRC for that, but just don't follow up on it. Just kind of leave it alone and say thanks, but I really want to talk about this. And there are carve-outs in the law that allow you to elicit this sort of wage history before the conditional offers, or before the ink is wet on everything. But I like to not tell people how to operate in the gray areas. I think it's just best to avoid them and just say it's a no-no on applications, interviews, reference checks, all that sort of thing. So just stay away from pay history.
There's got to be some leeway, though, with, like, on that conditional letter of employment. If I was going to offer you $19 an hour and I wrote it out and I said, here's your conditional letter of employment starting at 19, they're like, I can't do it for 19, but I can do it for 20, and my ceiling is 21. I must be able to have that conversation with that individual to hit that sweet spot for the hiring process.
Yes. So you're absolutely allowed to negotiate over pay.
Okay.
And once you've made a conditional offer of employment that includes all the terms of compensation, you can ask about pay history at that point. But you can't do it before you've kind of gone that far down the road. Did I see another question over here?
Essentially, they were answered.
Okay. Yes, Travis.
We've actually removed all that stuff because of a class we took with you guys. But the question I guess I got is, if we're hiring somebody, say at department head level, so there's no real set any grades in there, per se with us right now, are we allowed to ask for pay requirements or
Yes.
salary requirements on somebody like that?
So, I had a nice little segment called Ask This, Not That. You stole my thunder a little bit there, but I don't mind. So, one of my Ask This, Not That tips for when you're in an interview. Ask, do you have any salary requirements or pay requirements? That's a perfectly legitimate and acceptable question to ask. It is not okay to ask, what did you make at your last job? What are you making right now? Because those are two different things, and it's an important difference. So you can ask, do you have salary or pay requirements? So those are the, yes,
Is that when you're interviewing them or on the application?
you could do it either.
Okay.
Personally, I would typically envision that more as a discussion that would happen at an interview, but there's nothing to say that you couldn't put it on an application. So those are the really two technical things, the social security numbers and the pay history. The rest is what I like to call common sense, both for applications and for interviews. You want to keep everything tied to the job that you're hiring for. Okay? This sounds straightforward, but you'd be surprised how many times people trip over this. You don't want to ask about anything directly related to, or even that's going to get you going down the road of what we call in the law protected classes or protected statuses. I believe it's Frank, correct me if I'm wrong, but somebody is going to be talking about protected class and protected statuses. But in a nutshell, here's what they are: age, race, sex, gender, gender identity, gender expression, disability status, national origin, religion, whistleblower status. Have you made a whistleblower claim in the past? Workers' comp status. Have you made a workers' comp claim in the past? Those are all what we call protected classes and statuses under the law. Don't ever ask somebody, what's your religion, in an interview. You're going to get into hot water that way. So you want to stay away from anything that directly or even indirectly is going to lead the conversation there. I kid you not, but here's a horror story. I know some people were interested in hearing horror stories, but I spoke to somebody once who was going to be interviewing for a position, and they were going to be interviewing a young female, and there was a concern, what happens if I hire her and within the first few months she has a baby and she's going to go out on maternity leave? Can I just ask her during the interview, are you going to have a baby anytime soon? Because I kind of want to know that so I can plan. I have a lot of answers or a lot of questions that I get asked that don't have an easy answer. That's an easy answer. It's a flat out no. Not a good question. Don't ever ask something like that. So keep everything in the discussion focused on the job that you're hiring for, what the person's qualifications are, what they think and what you think makes for a good applicant and why they think that they're a good applicant for that position. If you keep it tied to that, you're going to be fine. A best practice for interviews, in my view, is if you're going to be interviewing a lot of people for a position, think about the questions you're going to ask ahead of time related to what they're going to be doing or their qualifications or their history or whatever, and type them out, and that way you can have like a form set of questions that you can ask everybody, and you can just jot their answers in there. And that's good for a couple reasons. Number one, you're ensuring that everybody gets consistent questions, so that you don't have somebody saying, well, you know, why was I asked about this and the other person was only asked about that. It's good to have consistency, but it's also very handy just to have your notes right there all organized so that when you're reviewing everything you can see, okay, I like these 3 people and I didn't like those 10. But I think that's a good practice. So my ask this, not that, other than the pay. Do not ask, how old are you? Because that's a protected class, and if the person, for any of these, the risk is, if you ask the question, you're not going to go to jail right away. The police aren't going to come kicking in the door and haul you off to the jail because you asked an unlawful question. But what the risk is, if the person that you're asking the question to doesn't get the job, then they're going to start to question, well, maybe is it because of this part of my background that they learned that I didn't get the job? Because they learned I have a disability, because they learned my religion or my gender expression or whatever. Those get to become very difficult conversations to have, and people start having those questions about why wasn't I selected? So, ask this, not that. Don't ask how old are you. It is legitimate to ask, on an application especially, are you 18 plus? Because you do have a legitimate interest in making sure that somebody is old enough to lawfully work and do what you need to do, especially with minors. So 18 plus, that's fine. Put that on the application. You can verify that, but don't say age blank and have them write in their age, because if somebody writes in 65 and a 40-year-old gets the position, you might be answering some difficult questions. Don't ask. Yes.
Should they not then ask, when did you graduate from high school, or some common denominator that would key into their age?
Right.
Yeah.
Should not.
Yeah.
You can't ask what year you graduated from high school, because that is a surrogate for
Right.
Same thing with asking for a copy of your driver's license.
Yeah.
So ask, did you graduate?
What's your highest level of education?
Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah. Do not ask, are you a United States citizen, or what country are you from, or anything like that. You do have a legitimate interest in making sure that people are lawfully entitled to work in the United States, but the way you get there is putting on the application, are you lawfully entitled to work in the United States? They can answer yes or no. And you can get there multiple ways. You can be a citizen, but you can also have a green card, all sorts of things. So don't ask, are you a United States citizen, because you're going to be in trouble there. Don't ask, do you have any disabilities that I need to be aware of, or something along those lines. What you want to ask is, are you able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodations? And that harkens back to the job description, because You're gonna wanna know what the essential functions of the job are, so the person can say, yeah, I can do that with or without reasonable accommodations, or no, I can't. But that's how you get there. You don't ask, are you disabled, or do you have physical limitations I need to know about? And we talked about the pay. Any questions about applications or interviews? Before we move on, yes?
Can you discuss, we talked about pay specifically, but a compensation package in the whole, in an interview? I mean, we're trying to lure people, we're not actually,
You can talk all you want about what you want to offer.
Okay.
You just can't go back to what they had before.
Right. Or tell me what sort of retirement benefits your last job gave, anything like that. Just stay away from
How about social media?
that. So, that's a great segue into my reference and background
I
checks.
must have known that.
Yeah. So social media, you can get a lot of good and bad information from social media. One thing you absolutely cannot do is you can't ask either an applicant or a current employee, give me all of your social media information and your login credentials. You can't require that they give that to you. There is a law that says that, because they don't want people to feel forced to give that sort of information to their employers, so their employers can go back and check up on them online. So don't ever require somebody to give you that sort of information.
At what stage, is that even in the background stage? When they sign a background release form?
So, background checks. We'll talk about that right now. You've gotten to the point where you've interviewed everybody, you've identified who you want to select, you made a conditional offer of employment. You can do background checks at that point. There's a couple different ways that you can do background checks. There's what they call in-house and using a vendor. In-house means doing it yourself or somebody within your office or within the city actually doing the background check. And there are different ways that that can be done. There's Info for Maine, which is a subscription service that will give certain conviction information for the state of Maine. But a lot of small employers, and frankly even some big ones, decide that they want to use Facebook or social media to do a background check. There's nothing specifically that says you can't, as long as you're not requiring somebody to give you their information. You can hop on Google and type in somebody's name and figure out they've got Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook and check everything. You can. I don't think it's a very good idea to do that. I suggest that you avoid doing that. And the reason is this, and it's also the reason you're interested in getting on that social media. People post a lot of interesting things on social media, but some of it may be information that you ought not to know. And that gets back to the protected class and statuses. So if you're digging through somebody's Facebook feed, you may learn that they've got some sort of mental health disability, let's say, or physical disability, or that they express their gender in a certain way, or whatever the case may be. You may learn information that you probably shouldn't know. And if that conditional offer gets withdrawn or something negative happens to that person, and they find out that you've been digging through their social media, the obvious question at that point is going to be, why did this bad thing happen to me? Is it because you found out that I have depression, or you found out A, B, and C, whatever the case may be? It's one of those difficult conversations that can be easily avoided. So stay away, my take anyway, stay away from social media background checks. If you're going to do it in-house, Info for Maine, and there are a couple subscription services like that that you can use to check. The benefit of doing it in-house is it's cheaper and sometimes faster than hiring a vendor to do it. But the risk is, no matter which avenue you take, you might learn some of this information that you should know. The other choice for doing it is hiring a vendor. There are companies out there that specialize in employment background checks. The drawback there is that they are pricey. It's a pay-for service, so it's a budget expense there. But the pro is, number one, they're professional background checkers, so they can have access to databases and information that you probably don't have access to. That could include convictions from outside the state of Maine. Info from Maine, I don't believe, has anything beyond the state of Maine. So they can get national, federal crimes as well as crimes from other states, things like that. So they really know what they're looking for, but it also limits the risk that you'll get exposed to information that you shouldn't know, because the results of the background check are going to be filtered through this third party that are going to be coming back to you. So you only get what you need to know. There is this fun little thing called the Fair Credit Reporting Act that applies if you hire a vendor to do a background check. So if you do it in-house, you're not subject to the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which has all sorts of notices and authorizations and disclosures that have to be given before the background check is conducted. Third-party vendor, you are subject to that. The good news is the vendors will typically take care of all of that documentation for you. I won't bore you with all the intricacies of what you need to make sure is in the file before you do that, but just if you have a vendor, have that conversation with them. What are you doing to make sure that we comply with the Fair Credit Reporting Act? Can I see your disclosures and notices? And just make sure that they're on top of it so that it doesn't blow back on you. That's background checks. Reference checks are another thing. Those are actually two separate things, reference checks versus background checks. Typically, you could do a reference check after you've made a conditional offer. I would say probably you want to do that before you've made the conditional offer. But reference checks are a handy tool to make sure that people, number one, have given you accurate information about themselves. But number two, get a little bit of insight about how they might be a good fit for the position.
Well, how much stock, I could pay 3 people to say something nice about me. So, I mean, how much stock do you put into that reference check?
It's a problem because people are pretty gun shy about being candid.
Right, yeah. We go, at least on the police and fire side of the house, we go way beyond the references to find the candidate. So I guess, do you recommend that, I guess I'm asking out loud, do you recommend that other departments stop at the reference check, or do you recommend that they go deeper than a reference check? Or?
So could you give me an example of what you mean by going deeper than the reference check?
So we send detectives out to people's neighborhoods and interview their neighbors. We interview their school teachers. We interview college professors. We go into their homes. We interview their spouses or significant others. We interview family members. And then when we go into their place of employment, we'll interview references, but then we'll interview other people that have worked with them. So you get, I was serious when I said that. I mean, you could actually have 3 people that say something really good about you, but is that the actual character of the individual? And we look to find what the true character is and what the patterns are. And if your neighbors are saying, no, it's quiet, everything's good, the spouse is like, never been a problem, this is a great relationship, references check out, and then I speak to 4 people that work with you and they say, no, outstanding individual, always at work, well, that's the person we want to hire. But if we start to see a pattern of behavior that doesn't fall up to what my references have told me, then that could be, for us, maybe not somebody that we want to move forward with.
So let me get some thoughts on it. So what you're describing, if you paid for it, for a service, instead of doing it yourself because you've got law enforcement capabilities, that would be an investigatory interview. And that's a higher level under the Fair Credit Reporting Act regulation. If you do it yourself, you can do it yourself. It's unusual to have to do it, but of course in law enforcement, you've got some unusual requirements.
Yeah.
The other thing you can do, though, if you're seeing a pattern of, well, this person looks good, but they were in a job 18 months, they were in a job 2 years, they were in a job 2.5 years, they've never held one longer than 4 years. Every employee in Maine has got 2 rights. You've got a right to ask your employer for a written statement of the reasons for your termination, and you've got a right to ask your employer for what's in your personnel file. So you can ask that applicant to go back to that employer and get their last evaluation and produce, you can't get it, but he can get it, and produce your last evaluation or evaluations within the last year of employment.
If they refuse to do that, is it enough to just say,
well, if they
we're
refuse
done
to
with
do
the
that, you want
process?
to have a conversation about
Sure.
what's happening.
Okay.
Now, is that asked at a conditional offer or any?
Yeah, this is after you've made your tentative selection of a candidate, I would say.
Quick question about the conditional offer. You go through the dynamic background check, you find some information that you don't think the employee or the potential employee would fit with you. When you rescind that conditional offer of employment, under what obligations do you have to share the information you found, or are you under no obligation?
There's a technical answer and a non-technical answer. Technically, I think generally you're not under any obligation to tell them why, unless they ask specifically. Would the written reason statute come into play there, where it's a conditional offer?
Yeah,
That's where I'm getting hung up.
It's not termination of employment, because employment hasn't begun yet.
Really rescinding the conditional
But
offer
it's
of
rescinding
employment.
And yet, in the world of reason and common sense, they're gonna wanna know what's going on.
Yeah.
And everybody's in some protected class or another. So if you want to avoid someone reaching the assumption that you did because of, pick a category, then it's probably good to give them some clue. Now, the question is, do you give your references assurances that what they tell you will be retained in confidence or not? And if you do, can you abide by that? I would think you could abide by it, but then you just got to figure out how to explain to the candidate, you're just, it's easy if you flunk the drug test, but if you flunk the background test, it's probably, as a matter of common sense, they're going to want to know what gives.
Could you say maybe it's worth you going back and talking to your current employer to determine why you didn't get the job, or?
Yeah, you can do it indirectly like that.
All right.
Due to contact with previous
Yeah.
employers, we found a
Yeah.
pattern of behavior that
Yeah.
Quick administrative question. Our current background check form has space for it to be notarized. Do you guys have an opinion on that? Just a witness or notary, or what threshold should we?
What's above the notarization?
I, as an applicant, am signing off that I'm giving you authority to check and do the background check. And I'm signing it off, and then there's a place on the bottom for it to be notarized.
Are they also like waiving liability on the part of anybody who tells you stuff?
Can I
Or
answer
they
that
just
after the
say,
next break?
I give you.
It is.
I'll get a copy of it
Yeah.
during the next break.
We have one of those,
Yeah.
a waiver of liability.
I'm not sure you need it notarized, I'm not sure there's much magic to that, but, it doesn't hurt.
Yeah, that was my thought. It doesn't hurt to have it there, but it's not necessary, I don't think. All right, so person survived the background check and reference checks. Probably going to want to send them a new hire letter. Just very quickly, you're going to want to make sure that they have a copy of their job description. They know what their start date is. If they're coming in for an orientation, make sure that they know what that schedule is going to look like and when they're expected to be there. Confirm their pay and compensation. It doesn't even have to be all that specific. You can say your salary will be X, and you'll be eligible, or you may be eligible for certain benefits that will be described in the benefits handbook or whatever the case may be. Then when you bring them on for onboarding, orientation is a good thing to start with. Again, this is common sense stuff, but sometimes people skip this step. And I found that orientation is a good opportunity to not only show the grounds to the person, but to introduce them to who they're going to be working with. And you'd be surprised how many times I've heard people kind of start a relationship off on the wrong foot by ignoring somebody when they come around for orientation, or being a little bit gruff, or shrugging it off like I don't have time. So your orientation is you're trying to set the tone for the relationship. You're trying to set a productive tone and a friendly tone so that everybody gets off on the right foot. So I say this only to remind you as supervisors, because you're going to be out there setting the tone. When somebody comes around, make sure that you go say hi, shake their hand, smile, be inviting, and set a welcoming atmosphere and tone for the relationship, so that somebody doesn't leave the first day thinking, oh geez, that's going to be a rough place to work. Because if that's their impression after the first day, then you're going to have a lot of hard work to kind of turn that thought process around as they start getting into the nitty-gritty of their employment. Paperwork, you want to do certain paperwork during orientation, your I-9 paperwork. I assume everybody kind of at least has an idea of what that is, so I won't get too far into the specifics, but I-9 is federally required paperwork that confirms somebody's identity and their eligibility to work in the United States. It's a pretty simple form. If you go on the ICE website, the Immigration Customs Enforcement, they have a link to it right there. I'm sure the office has plenty of copies. It tells you exactly what to do. Just read it and follow it, and you need to make sure that that's done within 3 days of when they start. So I won't bore you with how to do it because, like I said, the descriptions or the steps are pretty clear right on it. But those are my thoughts on the early stages of the relationship. I'm going to turn it over to John to talk about managing employees now that they've started working for you.
Let me talk a little bit about the probationary period first, and I'm going to talk about two things: the probationary period, then I'm going to talk to you about the whole set of rules about sexual harassment. So, one of the first things you're going to want to do is have the employee get a copy of the city employee manual or handbook. There's a copy of the contract, even though they may be probationary, so they know what the expectations are, what they can expect to find. The probationary period is a really important period for you to decide if the person is a fit or not. Your ability to take corrective action and to end a relationship is greatest during that probationary period, and you should take advantage of that, because you want to make sure that by the time the person survives probationary period and becomes a regular employee, that they're on track and that they're likely to succeed, and any problems, have been identified and they're not going to be fatal to the relationship. So it's really important in that period, and I know it's different by statute for police, somebody once a year after the academy. Yeah, and then, for others it might be 90 days, or by contract it might be 6 months. Whatever that is, know it, and take chunks, take periods of time within that, whether it's a 30-day, 60-day, 90-day review, or whatever you do, make sure that you don't get up to the 89th day of a 90-day period and the person's never heard anything from you about how they're doing, and then you have to make a tough decision because they're really not cutting it and no one's talking. So stay on top of those initial performance metrics and give them plenty of notice, just in fairness to them, and for you to identify, do I really think this person is doing the job, is doing what they should be doing? Maybe there are some delay factors, maybe they didn't have all the training for the job, but they were going to get it. But you've really got to use that early time to your advantage. And in fairness to the person's coworkers and your department and the person themselves, if they're not cutting it, you really need to address that and figure out why, and figure out if it's fixable or if it's not fixable.
Call that a tune-up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Frank, what's your opinion? One, I guess legally, and two, would you extend a probationary period for any reason?
I would, in the private sector, I would certainly do it. If you can do it, I would suggest you do it, again, with notice to the person that you're really not, you're not making it, we're up to the 89th day of 90 days or whatever, and we're not satisfied this is working, whether you call that an extension of probation or a performance improvement plan. I think sometimes that's appropriate and necessary. But again, if you have a hard stop because it's in a contract or a statute, then you've got to live with the period.
I have a question on the probationary period.
Yeah.
So I don't know if this is considered a protected class or not, but if the person, do you just have to focus on the essential job functions, or if their personality completely clashes with everyone else in the building and they're just not getting along with other employees, is that something to consider, or can you not even look at that during the probationary period?
That's a good question, and the answer is yes, you can look at that. Ideally, somewhere in your job description, there's something about getting along with others. But even if there isn't, there's certainly something in the personnel policy of the city, the employee manual, that talks about being a team player and approaching work in a constructive and in a positive way. And you can certainly identify that. If you are not dealing with someone with a psychiatric diagnosis that they have disclosed to you, then the fact that they're a misfit is fair game to correct them on. And if they're negative, or they're contrary, or they're backbiting, or they're doing things like that early on, it's a good time to address it. If it doesn't fit with your culture, they should know that, and they should make a decision, and we should make a decision about whether you want that misfit to continue. Yes, so it's only when we're dealing with a disclosed disability that you have to frame it in terms of this interactive process and look to the essential functions. And there you hope you've listed the essential functions that are truly essential, which include, ability to deal with people. So I'd like to just step out of that mode and talk to you about the harassment rules. And Maine, way before the Me Too movement, has had a pretty progressive set of rules about harassment and harassment awareness and training and prevention. And so every employer has to have a policy, and the city does. Every employer should do training of supervisors within the first year they become supervisors, and of employees within the first year that they become employees. And in addition, there's an annual notice that people should be getting of what the city policy is. So here's the annual notice. That's that. So those back.
Yep.
So I'm going to walk you down through this, and walk you down through it partly because the statute is quite specific about what you need to be taught. And you need to be taught two things, one as an employee yourself, and the other is as a supervisor. So wearing both hats, it's important for you to know what these rules are. So, first of all, yes?
But it's all the same?
What?
It's all the same for supervisors as for employees? It's not a different one? It's all the same?
This notice is the same for supervisors and employees,
Okay.
but supervisors have additional duties.
Right.
And we'll talk about
Oh,
what
okay, sorry.
So, first talking to you about the basics. So, we have fair employment laws, and the fair employment laws prohibit discrimination based on sex and gender, as well as a number of other categories. And so, one form of sex discrimination is sexual activity that's unwelcome, that's inflicted on someone in connection with the workplace. So, everybody takes a job because they need to earn a living. Everybody takes a job expecting that they have their personal dignity respected when they're in the workplace. And people take a job not expecting to have unwelcome sexual activity inflicted on them, whether it's sexual advances to them personally or an environment that's offensive because it's got sexual content to it. So this covers harassment by men against women, women against women, men against men. It covers any kind of activity on account of sex or of a sexual nature. So, sexual harassment is defined as unwelcome sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature. In order for that to be illegal, sexual harassment, it has to either be a situation where submission to or rejection of the conduct by an individual is used as a basis for an employment decision against the individual, that is, date with me or you're fired, or the conduct has the purpose or the effect of unreasonably interfering with that individual's work environment or their performance, or creates an intimidating, offensive, or hostile environment for that individual. Those are the definitions of illegal sexual harassment. It will be easy for you, however. You should just need to know that the rule is there's no unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature allowed. You don't have to worry whether it rises to that level. You don't have to wait until someone makes it a condition of employment. Just unwelcome sexual activity is prohibited. So, one of the things you've heard lately in the news is the phrase quid pro quo, this for that. And this is an example. Quid pro quo harassment is one kind, which is to say, you give me this, I'll give you that. If you want a raise, you have to do this with me, that kind of thing. So that's clearly prohibited. That's pretty black and white. The hostile environment harassment is broader and more general, and that can arise really from any kind of activity, sexual joking, text messages, suggestive calendars, conversation, and as well as talking about personal activities, asking personal questions, that kind of thing. So it's a variety, and it's partly in the mind of the beholder, as what someone perceives to be sexual tone. But certainly sexual propositions, asking questions about someone's sex life, using crude sexual names, repeated requests for dates, whistling, hooting, grunting, all that kind of stuff, or any kind of touching or grabbing or massages, physical restraint, staring at someone's body parts, taking unwelcome photographs, posters, calendars, all that kind of stuff, sexually suggestive internet or Facebook messages, because if it's from a worker to a worker, it's covered by this policy, even though it happens off the job. If it happens at a convention, if it happens at a meeting somewhere, if it's related to and arising out of the work, it's covered by this policy and it's prohibited. So, let's talk about some examples. Valerie winks at John as he walks past her in the hallway.
Happens all the time.
Valerie likes that. Is that sexual harassment?
Maybe he's got something in his eye.
What's that? Yeah, right. Maybe Valerie's got something in her eye. Yeah. Right. So it's ambiguous, right? May not be. May be friendly. May not be sexual at all. Depends on the context. Fred tells Sarah a joke that is sexually explicit, and Sarah laughs and tells him one back. That's sexual harassment?
No.
Okay. As a supervisor, you may not want that activity going on because it's still explicitly sexual in the workplace. But if it's not unwelcome, I guess if it's really truly welcome, it doesn't violate the law. It probably violates your policy, though, because you don't know what third and fourth person is listening to that saying, oh my God, what have I gotten myself into here in this workplace? Those two doing it may be having fun yucking it up, but it sets a tone in the workplace that you probably, as a supervisor, want to say, you know what, that doesn't belong here. So it's a yes and no answer there. Rob comes to work, says his back hurts. Mary offers to give him a back rub. He accepts, she gives him a back rub. Is that harassment? Well, again, it's not welcome, right? Felt good. She was happy to give the back rub. Not expressly sexual. It's a little close to the line in terms of personal touching.
Still not a good idea.
Yeah. May not be a good idea. And as a supervisor, you may want to say, you know what, that's not your role. But the point is not to let things get to the stage where the law is actually being violated by conduct in the workplace, but to set a tone. And and as a supervisor, it's your job to set that tone, both in terms of your personal conduct. You should make it your business not to engage in sexual innuendos or joking yourself, because you're the role model. People are going to watch what you do, and they're going to take their cues from what you do. And secondly, in many different workplaces, the public works department is very different from the library, it's very different from the police department, it's different from the fire department. There's always a tone. Sometimes you're under a lot of pressure, you might be working long hours, and you ought to have stuff going on. And there's a tendency to kind of loosen up and joke just as a matter of camaraderie. But within that context, as the leadership, it's your job without squelching every friendly exchange in the workplace, it's still your job to set the tone. And you set the tone in a way that directs it away from any kind of sexual stuff and into other things. And so that's just part of supervision, that people are looking to you to set that tone. And the people who are watching, who are offended by it, may not be the vocal ones. They may be the people in the back row, or the people who are just overhearing it, or who hear about it from someone else. They weren't even there, but, oh, did you hear what Fred said to Sal? You know how that goes. And then that tone gets set. And so you really need to, as department heads, it's probably the most important thing you can do in this area, is to set that tone and make sure it gets set before anybody gets into real trouble, before anybody, disciplinary action is taken, although there's certainly plenty of opportunity for that if necessary, to set that kind of a tone. So let's say something happens, and it's offensive, and it's of sexual nature, and you become aware of it. Well, there's two ways to become aware of it. One is you see or hear it, or it's reported to you by a third person. And the second way is the person who would experience it says, you know what, I don't want to make trouble for so-and-so, but here's what happened to me. In both cases, it's appropriate for you to take appropriate action. Now, people who experience that in the workplace are free to tell the person, you know what, that's off bounds. You're out of line. I don't like that. Don't do that. I don't want to hear that anymore. I don't want to see that anymore. Everyone's free and welcome to do that, and they should know that they have that power. But at the same time, although that may be the first line of defense, it's not required. There may well be situations where people are too intimidated, or because of the power relationship or whatever, they just don't feel comfortable confronting that directly to the person who's doing it. And that's perfectly understandable, and you should expect that that will be the case, that there will be a power dynamic or a relationship dynamic that causes the person who finds it unwelcome not to say so right on the spot. And so if you become aware of it, it then becomes your obligation to make sure that it's fixed. So the commitment of the city and every good employer is to provide a workplace environment that's free from this stuff. And the level of discipline, the level of curative action is commensurate with what's necessary to make sure that that promise is delivered on. It may be as simple as a supervisor going to another person, be another supervisor or whatever, and saying, you know what, I hear this happen, did it happen, and if it happened, it's not to happen again. And if it does happen again, there'll be disciplinary action. The other thing that comes with this policy is an absolute ironclad guarantee against retaliation for someone who reports it, someone who experiences and reports it, a third person who reports it, or someone who participates in an investigation of it, truthfully and honestly. And that is, there should be no cold shoulder, no mistreatment, no murmuring, well, that person's not got a sense of humor, none of that. You should make it your business to make sure there's no retaliation for people following the city's own policy and delivering on this promise of an environment that's free from this stuff. So the other thing that's important to have is a reporting policy. And in your handbook, you have a reporting policy, and the reporting goes to the city manager, Bill, to the assistant city manager, Travis, or to any department head that the employee is comfortable reporting to, either their own or another one. And so if you're a department head, that gives you a special responsibility. If you become aware of that, because you're a reporting receiver, you need to take that to Travis and Bill and make sure that it's promptly acted upon. There's nothing worse than a report that's made and that just lies there, not acted on. Then, at that point, if you become aware of activity and you don't take steps to address it, then the city begins to take ownership of the problem, because you're endorsing it by your silence, by your inaction. You're saying it's okay that goes on, and you don't want to do that. You want to bring it to someone who can investigate it and who can address it properly. So, yeah, the two ways that a city or any employer is liable is if members of management feel free to do this kind of stuff and do it. And then it's act of the employer. Or if you know it's going on and you tolerate it and you allow this environment to occur, either because you don't have a reporting policy or you have one but nobody follows through once a report is made. Now, as lawyers, we see all kinds of this stuff. And one thing that you see is, well, I don't want you to do anything about this, but here's what's happened. And so you've got to figure out, I don't want you to say anything, I don't want you to do anything, but here's what I'm uncomfortable with. So what do you do with that? Anybody ever run into that? Yeah?
Yeah, it doesn't excuse the conduct.
No.
It doesn't excuse what happened or what was said. It doesn't, just because that person doesn't feel comfortable with it, could be a whole host of reasons why they don't want to push it forward. But you still have to address what the conduct is.
Yeah, well, that's right. Because if you become aware of it, and you can tell the person, you know what, this is too important for me to just sit on that. We promised you a work environment that was free from that, and now I'm learning that maybe you haven't been given the work environment we promised that you'd have here. And so we need to do what we need to do to fix it. And you have to imagine the person kind of knew that, or they wouldn't have opened their mouth. So if you do hear of something, don't just say, oh, well, they told me not to do anything, so I forgot about it. No, don't do that. You gotta report it up the chain of command. You gotta figure it out in a discreet, proper, appropriate manner. You don't have to blow it out of proportion, but you do have to deal with it. So, anybody have questions about any of that? Yes.
It may not relate directly to what you presented thus far, but obviously city employees deal with members of the public all the time who might come into City Hall and act in a manner that wouldn't be appropriate if it was employee-employee. Does the employer have an obligation, if they observe that or if it's reported to them, to take some sort of steps to prevent that?
Okay, everybody get a question? So the answer is, as an employer, the City of Old Town tells its employees that their work environment will be free from this stuff. And that includes not just coworkers, it includes salesmen, it includes members of the public who come in and say, hey, you know, that kind of thing. I mean, you can and should, even with members of the public or with third parties, make it clear that if they're dealing with a city employee, they have to deal with them in a proper manner, in a way that's free from this stuff. So, yeah, good question. But yes, it's 360. The other kind of big piece of this law is everything that I just told you also applies to the other protected categories of the equal employment laws. So Josh listed them off, sex, race, sexual orientation, creed, color, national origin, gender identity, gender expression, age, religion, disability, veteran status, workers' compensation claimant, whistleblower status, and maybe others. The point is, if you see someone being abused because of their religion, say, or people are making racial comments, or anything of that nature, that kind of hostile environment harassment should be addressed in the same manner. You know what the equal employment laws say. If someone comes in here who's of a different race, a different religion, or because of their sex or their age, you don't want those jokes to be made. You don't want that environment to become toxic. You should address that in the same manner. Again, people come to work because they need to earn a living. They need to have their dignity respected, and this category should not become the basis of either harassment or any kind of quid pro quo. Once in a while, religion issues come up, and you just have to keep that separate from the workplace.
Could I add one thing?
Yeah, sure.
Earlier, Frank talked about Valerie Lincoln at John and the back rubs and the occasional joke. And individually, each one of those situations might not have risen to the level of discrimination, of harassment. But if there are multiple iterations of that and other people are witnessing it, then there can be a hostile work environment created. So if you've got people telling not just one joke, but they tell jokes on a regular basis, and perhaps there's even a whole crowd of people who find it funny, and then there's one person who doesn't. And then there's the back rub, and then there's the winking, and then the person who's not participating is not getting the job assignment they wanted. You're gonna end up with a human rights complaint. That's as problematic as the more direct and the clearer forms of harassment. So just be aware that the atmosphere that's created through even the small instances of small conduct can build up over time. And there are plenty of plaintiff lawyers out there who are going to latch onto those and build a complaint to the Human Rights Commission that looks on paper really good. And it's easy to do that. So even if something is simply inappropriate and not necessarily harassment in and of itself, you need to make sure that you're addressing it to prevent that atmosphere from developing.
I should say there also is, as mentioned in policy, a means for people to bring a complaint to the Human Rights Commission or to the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and that contact information is actually there in that notice. If an employer has a good complaint procedure and an employee unreasonably fails to use that complaint procedure, then that employer may have a defense against a claim. Likewise, this is not a political correctness rule. It's not a workplace civility rule. And in defending these cases, we often say, well, yeah, that was rude, that was impolite, but it didn't rise to that level. For purposes of this training, we're not taking that position because the best approach is to eliminate this stuff whether or not it rises to that legal level or not. So it might sound like we're talking out of both sides of our mouth that in defending a claim to say, oh, it didn't matter. For this purpose, it does matter, and you want to avoid that procedure. But we all have a right to bring a complaint. If you were here in the city of Old Town and you felt like you weren't getting responded to, you also have a right to bring that complaint if you choose. And that's part of the policy. It's the city's commitment to take these complaints seriously, to investigate them, and to take prompt and effective corrective action necessary to remedy the problem. And that's, you want these cases to be litigated by other employers, so you can read about them in the newspaper without it affecting your workplace. That's my message. We've been going hour and 20 minutes. Do you want to take about a little break sometimes? People take 5 minutes to stretch.
There's only one answer to that question. I wasn't going to say no. If it was thrown at me.
My apologies.
Watch out, Nate. I just like to say a conversation we had yesterday about those unfortunate and didn't apologize. What conversation? Exactly.
So it's down there?
Oh, I thought you wanted to put something in. I'm like a teacher telling me to spit on my gun.
Yep. Do it now.
What's up, Kevin?
Don't stand too close to the mic.
Who's Mike?
The one that's on with my phone next to it.
So much of us. Now, right, yeah. My wife worked really hard to make sure. You're gonna eat? No, we're just
Going back to Florida?
No, yeah, yeah.
Brunswick?
Really safe.
It's you.
It's you.
She. I bet she was.
It's metallic.
Why?
Don't drink that, man.
Sometimes that one's just too close to these.
It was his radio.
No, it's not. No, I use
My phone did it. I was over there.
every day. She got shoes that are still in the box.
So I'm going to, ready to talk a little bit more about some employment law stuff, and then I'm going to hand it off to John Farr. I'm going to talk about two things. One is, we've talked a little bit about these the statutes and the equal employment laws, and I want to go into a little more detail about particularly disability issues, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about performance reviews, and then John's going to pick up from there. So, on the equal employment laws, we've sort of rattled off all the different categories, and people are protected from job action from A to Z, hiring and recruitment determination, based on protected status. So it's just irrelevant, and you don't take any action in any way based on age, sex, race, whatever it may be. In respect to disability, there's a particular set of things that you as supervisors need to know about. Many of us have medical conditions of one kind or another. Many of us may have psychological conditions of one kind or another. The expectation is that a person needs to be qualified for the position that they're doing so that they can perform the essential functions of that position. Now, that qualification may require the employer to bend some of the rules of the job in order to allow that person to perform the essential functions effectively. So a person with bad eyesight might need a bigger screen, or some other kind of a thing. Someone with a lifting restriction might need some sort of lift assist, or might need someone else on the other end of a heavy box. And so I want to explain that dynamic to you and explain what the employer's job is. So in the initial hiring process, you're not obliged to ask anybody about disabilities. And if you do ask, you can ask just that limited question which Josh said, which is, can you perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodation? Some employers, and you may have a pre-employment physical exam, in which case you send the person off to a doctor, they take the job description, they look at the person, they say, yes, the person can do it, or no, yes, the person can do it, but only with the following accommodation, or no, the person can't do either with accommodation. Let's assume you don't do that, or in any event, the person passes the physical and they're at work. Unless somebody discloses a disability, you can assume that they have the ability to do their job, and you can hold them to it, mentally, physically, and whatever else. They've been hired for the job, they haven't told you otherwise, then. If somebody discloses a condition that is a serious impairment, an impairment that substantially limits one or more of their life activities, then that might trigger to you the fact that they have a disability that's protected under the law. So disability is defined as an impairment, physical and mental impairment, that substantially limits one or more of your major life activities. Walking, standing, whatever. If somebody has such an impairment, and they're identified as having a disability, they're still expected to perform the job, unless they make it known or it becomes evident that they need some kind of an accommodation. Like persons in a wheelchair and the shelves they have to reach are too high up. And so then, if someone discloses a disability and requests an accommodation, then the employer has an obligation to listen to that and respond. So you get into what's called the interactive process. In many cases, it will be simple. Yeah, we'll just vote the shells. In other cases, it's not so easy. Someone needs a shift change or needs some other kind of physical piece of equipment in order to do the job.
Platform shoes.
What?
Platform shoes.
Platform shoes, yeah. And then you get into an interactive process, right? Yes.
What if it's not a disability? What if it's like a treatment plan, long-term treatment plan, under, with like the doctor prescribed it or something? Shift change, or is that,
Say more about the example.
well, let me say like you got an employee that has chronic pain, ibuprofen, all that stuff's not cutting it.
Yeah.
Prescribes marijuana.
Uh-huh.
Public Works, a CDL operator, zero tolerance under federal government. Is there reasonable accommodations that have to be made for that employee, or you say, hey, where does that go?
Okay, so that's kind of a good example. With a person who has a physical impairment or injury, there are three sets of laws you want to think about. One is the workers' compensation laws, because if they had an on-the-job injury or an on-the-job exacerbation of an injury, you need to think in terms of what their workers' comp rates are and report it to the carrier and deal with that. Second, if a person has worked for the city for 1 year or more, they will have rights to take medical leave, either on an intermittent basis or a partial leave basis or a full basis under the Family and Medical Leave Act. And under the Family and Medical Leave Act, you have a very specific, fairly narrow set of forms you can give them to request their doctor to certify what the, quote, serious health condition is that forms the basis for their FMLA leave. The people get up to 12 weeks of FMLA leave per year if they have a serious health condition under the FMLA. Separate and apart from that, an individual with a disability has a right to reasonable accommodation. And reasonable accommodation, so the first question is, your guy is in part of a long-term treatment plan, he's got chronic back pain and the drugs aren't helping. So first off, does that person have a disability? Well, if they've got an impairment, namely a back problem, and that substantially limits their ability to engage in major life activities like lifting and all that, then the answer is probably yes. So probably that person is in the category with the chronic back pain of someone with a disability. So then you get into reasonable accommodation. And so accommodation is any kind of modification to the conditions of the job that could enable the person to perform the essential functions, like driving a truck or whatever. An accommodation has to be, and you're entitled in the interactive process to ask the employee for confirmation from their doctor if that particular accommodation is medically necessary, or if any accommodation is medically necessary. You're not necessarily required to give them the accommodation they ask for. You can give them one that would also be effective to let them get the essential functions done. So in your example,
yeah,
you're talking about someone who says, okay, the ibuprofen's not working, and my doctor wants me to smoke marijuana or take marijuana by pill form.
Right.
So now I've got THC in my system,
Exactly.
and I'm going to flunk a drug test.
Right.
And in the case of somebody who has to have a CDL, a commercial driver's license, where it is prohibited to fail the drug test, then that accommodation is not reasonable because it's unlawful.
Okay.
So in that case.
So then how would you, I guess, how would you broach to, so you could terminate the employee then at that point?
Well, if the person, your duty is to give what reasonable accommodation you can give, but you can't expunge the requirement that CDL drivers are subjected to drug testing, because you don't have that power.
Right.
So that person's got to have to come up with a different medication that addresses their issue if they can. And if they can't, then they can't. So you don't terminate them for asking.
Right, no, I don't,
But
no.
if they can't bring themselves to a point where they can lawfully and properly address the pain issue and still do the job of digging or driving or whatever it is they're doing, then you've met your obligation. If they can't come to work, they can be off for 12 weeks under FMLA while they try to appeal or they try to get a new medication regimen. If they use up their 12 weeks, then the question is additional leave required under the disability requirements, the ADA and the Human Rights Act? And the answer is maybe yes. Sometimes with additional leave beyond the FMLA leave, a person will recover. And it becomes a question is it just indefinite? The doctor says, yeah, maybe someday in 2 years the person will get better enough to do the job, and therefore you have to give them 2 years leave? No. But if there's a finite period of time within which the person is medically expected to regain the ability to do the essential functions, then and unless you can show that it's an undue hardship on the city, then you would want to give that accommodation. So that the checks on reasonable accommodation are A, it's unreasonable or unlawful, B, it's an undue hardship on the city, or C, it's a direct threat. That is, a direct threat is where someone comes in, but the accommodation would pose a danger either to themselves or to a coworker because of the way that they're proposing to do it. One possible accommodation is transfer to a different open position. If there's an open position that person can do, they can't do their own job, and there's a vacancy in a different job that they can do, then that could be a reasonable accommodation to that.
Would that be anywhere within the city they could transfer to that job? Like,
if they're qualified, yeah.
so if I can work off that example for just a minute under reasonable accommodations, let's say that they've gone through and they've used 6 weeks of FMLA, the doctor says you're fine to come back to work, but you are being prescribed medical marijuana for your chronic back pain. If that is going to violate they're going to fail the drug test for the CDL, but if there were other jobs or other things or other pieces of apparatus at Public Works they could drive that didn't require CDL, reasonably do they have to allow that to happen where they require the CDL to be part of their employment?
Marijuana is a difficult issue because it is illegal under federal law. And the fact that the state allows it doesn't make it other than illegal. It would be like someone having used alcohol, to get through the work day. You're not really required to do that, even though someone might say, well, you just need to drink the night, every 4 hours, you'll be fine. You would want to work with that person to see if you can come up with some kind of a treatment regimen that would address their issue. Marijuana is a hot issue, and it's much debated. We had a case that Anne Marie Story, our partner, handled where somebody wanted the workers' compensation system to pay for their marijuana. And so far, the ruling is no, because it's illegal federally, you don't have to do that. That may well change. That's a tough example, but increasingly common. The fact that someone has a medical marijuana card and comes into work and say, well, I've got back pain, I went to my doctor down in Scarborough, be well, my friend, he gave me this card, and now I can smoke dope, right? You can still require that someone, while they're working, be sober and free and not under the influence of marijuana, even though they may have this card to use on the weekend. So it's not necessary that you require someone you allow someone to work while under the influence of a substance like that. If it's prescription medication and a doctor says this is medically necessary and the doctor will certify that the person can drive or operate machinery or do whatever it is at the dosage level that person is at, then that's a different story. If they can, they can. If they can't, they can't. Marijuana doesn't really come with a dosage level at the present time, and it's a little different.
Right, what happens if an employee violates some rule or has a performance problem phones, and then you as the supervisor sit them down and talk about it, and then they say, well, it's because I've got X disability that I've had these issues. Is that, how do you handle that?
Everybody follow that? So if someone has the infraction, they're working along, they're not meeting standards, they're below performance levels, or they engage in misconduct, and you sit them down in a disciplinary interview setting and say, you know, I want to hear your side of the story, and the reason is, well, the reason I did that is because I have depression. Or the reason I did that is because I have this anger issue and I'm being treated for it, but my medication is off. You are not required to go back and expunge or forgive past conduct before you were put on notice of a disability. It doesn't work, it's not a get out of jail free card. It's not, doesn't work retroactively. It works prospectively. The idea is if someone has a condition and they need accommodation, their obligation is to let you know that before they engage in a workplace infraction or fail to perform, and then ask for the accommodation going forward. So, a good question. Yeah, it's not retro.
What happens if that is brought to your attention and you offer a reasonable accommodation and they refuse to take it and the pattern continues?
So you're obliged to come up with a reasonable accommodation that will address the issue. And it doesn't have to be the one the employee wants. If you offer a reasonable accommodation, for whatever reason they choose not to accept it, and having not accepted it, they fail to meet performance standards, and they don't continue in the interactive process with you to identify a different accommodation that will address that matter, then you can take job action against them. What they're supposed to do is press on with the reasonable accommodation process. Well, you didn't like what I offered, I don't like what you offered, let's come up with a third choice that we can both work with. With reasonable accommodation, it's often the case that the person who walks away from the table first loses. So if the employer says, oh, we've done all we can, and there was something else they could do, the employer may be at risk. The employee says, no, I don't want to do that, even though they could do it, and they don't come up with something else, then the employer's met their burden. So, good question. Yes.
I'm still going back to Steve's question, I think, that I'm having a hard time processing, and the comment that the chief made, but I'm not sure how they end up handling that in the end, because CDL driver or not, correct me if I'm wrong, whether you're driving a pickup truck or not, you're still subject to those standards with a license. So how are they going to handle something like that?
So you're talking about someone.
The question that Steve asked in the middle about the marijuana,
Yeah.
whether he's driving a pickup truck or not, because they made accommodations, he still has to be drug tested if he gets stopped because he's carrying a CDL license.
Well, he don't if he doesn't have a CDL. He doesn't have, he don't come into any random drug test. You can drive and.
Well,
Oh,
what
you
if you
can
get
be
an
impaired under marijuana.
Oh, I know you can, but.
If someone is impaired with either marijuana
Right.
or alcohol,
Yeah.
to the point that they're operating under the influence of that substance, that's unlawful. They
Oh,
get
yeah.
arrested. And the city does not have to put someone on the road who is so impaired that they could be
Right.
arrested for it.
No, I get that. I mean,
But if he doesn't have
I'm
a
just-
job for him, how do they handle it?
Well, then in the interactive process, you say, you can't come back to work if you need to be smoking marijuana so that you're high during the workday. So if you can find another pain relief mechanism, fine, otherwise take your leave as much as you have leave available and have to do it.
Yeah.
You're not required to put that person in perspective.
And you shouldn't put them on the road, because if that person gets into an accident, that's a huge liability.
Yeah, and that's,
The fact that the person has the status of someone who is taking medical marijuana in their off time without coming to work or under the influence, that status in and of itself is not going to be basis for terminating employment. In fact, that would be discrimination under state law.
Well, yeah, but the problem there is, it stays in your system for 3 weeks.
that's right, and that's the problem with the whole conversation.
It's going to stay in your system, but you have to judge how the person is behaving, if the person is behaving impaired or not. Because there is no way to, there's no alcohol test,
There's no
Right,
presumptive testing.
right.
Right, so in the non-CDL context, we get into this grade.
Right.
In a CDL context, it's.
And then you say, well, yeah, he's acting funny. Well, maybe he is, maybe he's not. You know, now you're picking on me, so now you're making a hostile work environment, and blah, 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 and all it's been out of control.
You just gotta work it through. You gotta work it through. I'm gonna say one more thing, I've been talking a long time. I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about performance reviews, because that's really the meat of the supervisory tool. I hope you do them. If you don't do them, you probably ought to do them. You ought to do them on some kind of a regular schedule, and they can be a very useful tool for management, for supervisors, to just kind of have a little watershed moment with an employee. Ideally, you'll have a form. Ideally, the form will incorporate something about what is expected of this person from the job description. The biggest rule that plaintiffs' employment lawyers will say applies is that there should not be surprises. Before someone gets disciplined, before someone gets terminated, it should not be a surprise unless they've done something dramatic and sudden. More likely, there's been a deterioration of performance, a pattern of performance, and it's the employer's obligation to let the person know where they stand. It's an obligation to that individual and to that person's coworkers who may be putting up with substandard performance, and an obligation just to the team itself to get the job done. So, performance evaluations, I would say if there's one common theme that employment lawyers get, it's the employer who calls up and says, I am just so sick of this employee, I need to fire them. I need to fire them this afternoon. Okay. Have you got any discipline in their file? Oh, no. Have you talked to them about the problem? Well, I've mentioned it a few times. Do they realize how serious the problem is? Well, I don't know if they do or not. They just, I need to take this action. So that becomes a problem because people for whom it's a surprise that the employer is so fed up that they're ready to take job action, are not necessarily being treated fairly, even though the poor performance or the misconduct may be very real. Right? It's important that when you do a performance evaluation, you don't pull your punches. Because very often we'll ask, well, let me see the person's last 2 or 3 performance evaluations, and it's all checked good or very good. And yet the supervisor is being driven crazy by the underperformance. And you ask why, and it comes out like, well, I wanted to encourage them. I didn't want to confront them. I have to work with this person every day. I didn't want to give them bad news. It was just easier to check the middle, on a scale of 1 to 5, everything's a 3. Really it should be a 1 or a 2. I didn't want to raise any red flags. I didn't want to get in an argument. That can be very hard for us to work with and kind of unfair to the employee. So sometimes as a supervisor, you've got to be the bearer of bad news. You know what? We really do have a problem in this area. You're a nice person. You've got many good qualities, but there are things that you need to improve for this team's benefit. And have that hard conversation and take that action.
Can I tell a war story on that?
Yeah.
So this inclination for people to soft pedal and be the nice guys is very real. We see it all the time. But you're setting yourself up for problems doing that. So just as a war story or an example, I've had a case where there's an employee, and one of the problems with this employee is that she was doing tasks that were not her job. They fell within some other job category, and her supervisor, on paper, because of course there's no written discipline or anything like that, but verbally was saying, you got to stop doing that. I want you doing these tasks. That's for somebody else. But eventually this person was let go, and one of the issues in this case is what was the person doing that they were supposed to be doing versus what were they doing that was not their job that they weren't supposed to be doing. Well, if we go back to the performance review a year before they were let go, wouldn't you know it, in the teamwork section, the supervisor said, Mrs. So-and-so is such a great team player that she's always willing to go out and help people in other departments with their tasks. What? Wait a minute. You've been saying the exact opposite thing for a year. That's one of the issues with this person in this case right now, and yet you commended this person for it in a performance review. That puts you in a really tough place to say, no, it really wasn't a positive attribute, it was a problem. Well, I understand you want to be the nice guy and you want to be encouraging, and that's why you did it in the performance review, but now we have a lot of explaining to do, and it's gonna give us an uphill battle. So you want to tell the truth, you can be firm in these things, and you can be constructive while also being truthful. So I throw that out there as a cautionary tale.
Yeah, and I'll add one. The last jury trial I did in Penobscot County Superior Court on an age and whistleblower discrimination case, the plaintiff's lawyer put up on the overhead all these evaluations, again, one of these 1 to 5 scales, and the person was getting 3.5s and 4s. We put on the fact that the same supervisor gave 4.5s to 5s to every other single member of the department. But if you didn't know that, and if you just looked at the form, you wouldn't detect that the guy was performing as badly as he was. And the question was, well, why did you do that? And she said, well, it would affect his raise. It was a mathematical calculation. I didn't want to cut his pay, so I tried to give him the numbers that would give him the raise. So, fortunately, the jury saw it our way, because there really were problems, but this kind of thing didn't help. And so I'd encourage you to be honest and candid. So speaking of problem employees, John is going to...
All right. First, I'm going to jump on the bandwagon here and say that performance evaluations are under-evaluated. I mean, you need performance evaluations, and you need to take them seriously, because they are one of the best things that you have about documenting a person's behavior, performance, whatever, without actually getting into this disciplinary stuff. Eventually, poor behavior can result in discipline, but this is your means of having that non-confrontational discussion with the employee about, this is what you're doing well, and this is what you're not doing well, and this is your goals to improve, so that we don't get down to this stuff that I'm going to be talking about here. And being a supervisor sucks. I mean, there's no way around it. Sometimes you've got a job to do that's very unpleasant, but you've got to do it, and you've got to be honest. Take a look at the form you're using for evaluations and read it. A lot of times you'll see evaluations that are numbered 1 through 5, and you circle 4 or 5, whatever it is for the category. But you need to make sure you know what those numbers are, because 3 may be in your mind, that's not so great, person's only got a 3. But the definition of what a 3 is satisfactory. And 4 and 5 are above the average, and 1 and 2 are needs improvement. So when you're circling a 3, and you really mean needs improvement, then you're just basically are not conveying the correct information to the employee. Because when I go down, and when Josh goes down, and we're looking, and Frank goes down, and we're all looking at these personal evaluations, we're looking for the left 2 columns, what's checked as needs improvement or poor performance. And when we see a 3, there's not a whole lot we can do with that. And sorry if I'm waving a bloody finger on paper, which always report workplace injuries.
Workers' comp.
All right. So.
You want a Band-Aid?
That's how I prefer to do it. If it doesn't
The guys
stop,
in the
if it
back.
doesn't stop, I'll take it.
Sorry, I have a question.
Oh, yes.
Is it okay to eliminate the actual number and just use the description? The employee is performing satisfactorily, blah, blah, blah. I mean, you may use that same verbiage 12 times, but.
You can use whatever form the city wants to adopt,
Okay.
but I would recommend using the same form uniformly. So I wouldn't suggest that one department just ignore the numbers and just write the narrative. So you can alter the form. A lot of forms I've seen have gotten rid of the numbers altogether, and they have letters like NI for needs of improvement, or satisfactory, or SG for super good, whatever it is. And that's fine. And perhaps those are better than numbers, because numbers are easy to ignore and may mean different things if you're not paying attention to the actual definition. So, yep. But the hard part oftentimes is just being honest with the employee and saying, you're a really nice person, and I respect you, and you're just not getting it. and therefore I'm marking you down, you're gonna get a 2 or a needs improvement, and this is how you pull yourself out of it. And it's hard to do, and a lot of people are rushed when they're filling out these evaluations. Why, thank you.
You can't say paper cut in front of EMS.
Right?
Sign a waiver?
You guys want to evaluate these?
I don't know, I gotta talk to you
Okay.
You know what else makes it hard?
Super good.
You know what else makes these hard, especially in this government setting, is there's no merit tied to these. You know, you can throw out a form and say, oh, you need improvement. They do that improvement over the year, and they don't get nothing for it, except the same raise the slackers get. You know, it makes it difficult. And then you know what you've created? A hostile work environment, because your employees are all pedo at you for going through this exercise.
Well, you know, it's certainly good if there is an incentive to do well, and the city may revalue positions from time to time, may give raises, maybe they don't, maybe you just get COLAs. But in the end, if you keep getting consistent needs improvements, at some point that's going to come to a head, and it's going to end up in discipline, and it could eventually end up with termination. So that's the stick side of things. It's nice if there's a carrot out there too, but as a supervisor, you're helping your employees by being honest with them so that they know what they're doing wrong and how they can do better. So in the end, it's an act of kindness. All right. Dealing with difficult employees. All right. Now that's kind of a broad topic, so I'm going to break it down into different kind of difficult employees. The first kind is the kind that just doesn't mesh with the organization, and we talked about this a little bit before when dealing with the probationary periods. And if you've got an employee who just doesn't mesh with everybody else, and there's nothing wrong with them, they just have a personality that they don't fit in, then you can exercise that probationary period and say thank you for having applied, and we're going to exercise this right before you become a full-time employee. That 6-month period, and except for law enforcement, that 6-month period is set in statute unless you've got a grandfathered longer period of time. Once that 6-month period expires, the person then, most positions, will get a property interest in their job. Now, as a government, you can't take away property without due process. So that means that once the 6-month period is expired, the person has the right to due process and to only be terminated or disciplined for cause. So that's the important thing with the 6-month probationary period, is that you've got that 6-month trial period in which you can let an employee go for whatever reason, as long as it's not an illegal reason. So if the person's just not fitting in, that's an appropriate reason that you could say, I'm going to let you go. Now, if the person's not fitting in because they keep bringing up these pesky safety violations, something like that would be a problem, because that's protected reporting, and that's not going to count. But otherwise, it's a pretty open door if the person's not doing well. All right, so that's probably enough said about that. The other kind of difficult employees, perhaps, is the underperforming employees. And the first line of defense is those performance evaluations to let them know what they're doing wrong and how to improve. And then the third kind is really the employee that's just not behaving well, that they're violating whatever policies or procedures that you have, and then you're going to end up having to have some discipline act if it doesn't improve. All right. What are the things that you can do before getting to the discipline level? The first thing you want to do is make sure you've got good communication with your employees. If there's a problem and you see it, you might be able to nip it in the bud by having a simple conversation with that person. Informal counseling, just have that discussion saying this is the kind of conduct that's just not appropriate to the organization, so you know once you've given that counseling, the person should be on notice that that is no longer acceptable behavior. You could even review the the personnel ordinance, personnel policy, or union contract, if it addresses it as well. You want to set work expectations, and you can do this again through the performance evaluation. Every year, you should say this is what you need to work on, or this is what you're doing well. Progress from, make sure we know. Consistency, you want to be consistent with all your employees. Make sure that, there may be people who are on your staff that you get along with better and you may be friends with. You can't be friends with your employees, but you may like them better. You have to still treat them equally with all of your employees, because treating people differently is going to get you in trouble. It may not be tomorrow, it may not be the day after, but eventually it's going to get you in trouble. Whether it's through a civil rights complaint or simply lots of grievances, that can happen as well. And then the last thing you want to keep in mind is you need to document everything. And I believe that Josh or Frank touched upon this earlier. But if you don't document something, then it pretty much doesn't happen. If you do an informal counseling of a person, it's not considered any form of discipline. But you need to make a note, you stick in the file that I talked to such and such on this day, just to remind them that it's inappropriate to leave the banana peel on the floor, or whatever it is. Just so that there's a record that has happened in the past. That way, 3 months later, when you cite them for dropping grapes on the floor, then you'll know that this is a trend, that the person has a problem with fruit. And eventually, it could lead to something further. But if you don't document it, A, you could forget, B, the employee might forget, and C, if something happens down the road, it probably isn't going to be given as much weight as if it was documented.
Is this something that has to be signed by both parties, both individuals of that discipline, even if it's informal, if you're just documenting it so it's not a word against word type thing if it ever comes up?
No, it doesn't have to be signed. If it's something that's more important, you probably want to have it signed, just to have it acknowledged. You generally want to let someone know if you're going to put something in a personnel file. But for a low-level counseling, just this happened today and we discussed it, and you don't have to have it signed.
But in that regard, would email be enough? So in my position specifically, as a lieutenant, I answer to him, captain, and then deputy chief and public safety director. Wouldn't email just go, hey, this happened today, this is what I did, and that's enough to set in writing? Or would I need something else?
That's enough of a writing, yes, but make sure it's printed off and a physical copy is put in the file, just because things like that can disappear fairly easily.
In the lawsuit context, a common scenario that we see is, the boss comes in and says, I fired this guy because I talked to him 10 times about X. Did you ever write him up for it? Did you ever make any sort of memo about it? No. Well, the effect of that when you get into a lawsuit is, if there's nothing in writing, you can still rely on that prior oral warning or series of prior oral warnings, but it becomes a he said, she said. You're going to have the employee probably on one hand say, that didn't happen, I never got that warning, or maybe I got warned once, but it certainly wasn't 10 times, or it wasn't for this, it was for that, whatever the case may be, and that you're going to have to bring in the supervisor and 10 other people who witnessed it or knew about it to say, yeah, these things actually happened. So you can still get to the end of the road without documentation, but it makes it a lot more difficult to do it. It's a lot easier for you guys and a lot more difficult for the employee to rebut if there's a piece of paper in there that says, I spoke to John on this day about this issue and gave him a verbal warning. Or even better, if it's a written warning where both sides sign off on it so that you can't say, I didn't get it. Maybe they'll say, I didn't agree with it. Maybe they'll say it was a bogus warning, but they're going to be in a tough spot trying to say, I didn't get it. So that's where documentation can really help your case if you get to the point of the lawsuit.
Yeah. And you just may not remember. I mean, something happened 10 years ago. Gee, did I talk to him on this day or that day? And the employee says, well, I don't remember. Did you talk to me at all? And at least if there's something in paper in the file, You say, oh yeah, it was June 4th, and we talked about this, and it says that we discussed it, and you were fine, in a way. Really, it's no different than someone testifying, except for that paper carries more weight, because paper doesn't forget. It's only as good as information that goes down on it, but it's something that's going to last, and it could be a matter that supervisor who had the discussion has since left, and a new supervisor has come in. A lot of the documentation, a lot of the point of documentation is just to inform people later on of what happened. That's why documentation needs to be complete enough that you can go over and pick up a file and say, I see, this is what happened, this is the facts, and this is the problem, this is how it was resolved. And if you don't have that information on it, then the paper's really not going to be worth as much.
I had a question about supervision. So in public safety, we rely on frontline supervision on a daily basis and refer to them as our gatekeepers to liability. With that being said, there's been, both police and fire are unionized. So you get to a point where you tiptoe a tightrope as to, am I putting a supervisor in a bad position because they're a union employee, they're a union member as well, and is the union going to take up the offense of, you've put a supervisor in a spot where they're investigating a fellow union member. And I guess, so where does the city kind of stay, or where would you stand on that point? I've had to put a supervisor in a position before where it was a holiday, we were out of the area, Garrity had to be readied and intox had to be taken. So at that point, you're putting a supervisor in a pretty tight spot but you're gonna lose, you could lose, whatever that blood alcohol level was if you weren't to do that.
I'm going to talk about investigations in a little bit,
sorry.
but that's all right. In that situation, the fact that the supervisor is also a member of the union, that does make it difficult because the person is, a union member with the others who he's or she's disciplining. But it's their job and it's their responsibility to carry out their job. And if they don't do it, then management or their supervisor needs to take action to make sure that they're doing their job correctly. There's no good resolution there. It's just a matter of holding people accountable for doing their jobs. And frankly, the union contracts, you've got to follow them. You've got a contract that says what the process is and all that stuff. But you've also, on the city side, have a personnel policy that has very similar things. So in a way, they're not really that different. There are differences, but basically, you come right down to it, you're very similarly situated. So I think I've avoided your question. All right. Raising on document questions, blah, blah, blah. Oh, yeah. Josh has mentioned on a couple of occasions the employer who calls you up and says, I want to fire this employee, and these are all the reasons, going back for 10 years. And maybe I advise the person of the problem in the past, maybe not. In public employment, you need to make sure that you're focusing on the current events and not necessarily link back to something that happened 10 years ago in the person's past. Certainly, things that have happened in the past can't influence the outcome in terms of what you ultimately decide to do in terms of discipline or performance reviews and so forth. But because the person has a property interest in their job, you need to make sure that you're not reaching back to things far in the past. In fact, it can just hurt your credibility by doing so. If you go to the Maine Human Rights Commission to defend something and suddenly for the first time you're mentioning things that happened 10 or 15 years ago as reasons why you took this action against the person, it's just going to look uncredible or incredible, not credible. And you're going to get yourself into more trouble by dredging the lake and bringing in all the junk that's there.
John,
All right.
to
Yes.
that point, I remember, and I think it's still in the collective bargaining agreements, when I served with the police department, there was a heavy focus on the informal, the counseling stuff, not being a forever thing. So I believe there was purge requirements of like 6 months or a year, maybe, on counseling and the police contract when I was there. But anyways, there was a mechanism in place to promote more employee engagement, more documentation of this stuff, but it wasn't a forever brand. Do you guys have an opinion about that kind of stuff?
I have an opinion, all right.
I suspected you might.
That makes things difficult in a way. You can't necessarily, if there's old discipline that's been expunged from the file because of lack of time, then you can't rely on that in terms of giving. Really, that would only come into play if you're dealing with the remedy. If you find that a person has violated the policy and that some amount of discipline is warranted, then you can look at the rest of the circumstances to decide what the appropriate remedy is. And a lot of times you look at the person's history of discipline. And if there's recent discipline related, then you're going to get a much higher level of discipline issued. And if not, then even in the city side, if something is old, it's 10 years ago, and the person's been a great employee since then, you're probably not going to rely on that so much in terms of how it impacts your remedy. But if the discipline has been expunged, you just can't consider it. That doesn't mean that the discipline should necessarily be shredded and never heard from again. You may need to keep copies of that for purposes of investigations from Maine Human Rights, if that ever should happen. So
does that mean it doesn't actually go away? I guess that's the question. Does it ever actually, where does it come back into play? Does it, or does it not?
if someone were to come and say, I've been sexually harassed, and they file a complaint to the Maine Human Rights Commission, and they say, this employee has been harassing me for years, they've never taken any action, the employee may have some prior history, but it's been expunged because of time. You want to show that you actually have taken steps to address complaints, prior complaints, then that's when it would come into play. You could say that, yes, we have taken action to address bad conduct in the past. They may be expunged and have no more value in terms of the person, that individual, in terms of their personal history going forward, but it still happened, and that still can be a benefit to you.
Would the union have a right to step in and deny that, where it was, if it was in a bargaining agreement, that it be expunged?
It depends on the wording.
Okay.
Yeah. We actually had that case with another public employer, where there was a pattern of conduct of a particular person who, over 10 years, had done 3 or 4 things. All of it expunged for purposes of progressive discipline under the agreement. But in terms of the absence of mistake, or in terms of the challenge that the employer was totally toothless and ineffective in dealing with this chronic offender, we were able to produce it for those limited purposes. But it's still, under the just cause standard, if you're going to go with a progressive discipline standard, you've got to follow the currentness of the collective bargaining agreement. So if it says get rid of it after a year or 2 years, you've got to do that for that purpose. But it doesn't mean, as John says, that the thing never existed. In fact, under the state archive rules, discipline has to be kept for a long period of time.
Very long period of time. And yeah, and it's a difficult situation. I would prefer that those clauses didn't exist, because I think they just make things less clear. And if you've got discipline in your history and it's recent, that's going to have greater weight. And if it's old, then it probably shouldn't be given any weight, regardless of whether it's expunged or through union contract or on city site.
Can I ask just a follow-up with you and Frank on that? I don't practice employment law, but I guess I've always viewed personnel files as sort of a sacrosanct repository for the sort of information you're discussing. So when it's purged from the file, but you retain it somewhere, where do you retain it?
I think that it would be fair to put it in a file that's labeled Maine Human Rights Defense or something like that. Scale discipline. Keep out, never read. You know, it's kind of sealed document at that point because it's got no value with respect to an employee. But I also would not want to see it shredded and be gone completely, because there may be, the employer may have a legitimate need for that component in the future.
Wouldn't it be just enough just to seal it, I guess, going too far down this hole, but just to seal it in an envelope and right on the outside of it, expunge counseling memo for whatever the topic is.
Yeah, if your contract says that you can do that, that would make sense. But a lot of contracts just say it's expunged, and so an employee might be unhappy to have a manila file in there that says expunged, because that implies that there is some.
Still there.
Why not just throw it away? If you're gonna expunge it, why not just throw it away? Because you're basically, as an employer, saying it didn't happen.
Well, yes, because if let's say the Public Works Department has a human rights complaint where one member says, I've been sexually harassed, this has gone on for 10 years, and I allege that you, employer, have never addressed it before, and you've never taken on discipline against anybody because of these rude jokes and inappropriate comments and all the posters and all that other stuff that goes on in those cases. And the employer is going to reply, well, yes, we have taken steps, we have tried to enforce this policy. And you can see there's, several people have been penalized for having engaged in that conduct in the past, and here's the discipline. So that's a proper and a valid use of expired discipline. Now, it may be that because of the collective bargaining agreement, that can't be used against the employee in any future discipline, and so it's appropriate to have it removed from the personnel file. But it shouldn't be deleted altogether because there are appropriate uses for it. Not to mention the freedom of access law, which says that you're supposed to keep these for 60 years. So there's that other competing perspective as well. All right. I have to be bogged down here. So I wanted to very quickly talk about performance improvement plans before we talk about actual discipline. A performance improvement plan is a individualized plan that's centered on a particular individual, and it can be the result of either a poor evaluation or because of discipline for poor conduct or for performance. So it doesn't matter really how it comes up. If you've got an employee who's underperforming, you can make a specified plan to try to help them succeed. The performance improvement plan is going to take a look at their particular situation and say, this is what you need to work on to improve. And I need to see improvement by a date certain. And if you don't improve by then, this is the consequences. This is what could happen. You could be suspended or terminated or what have you. So it's a solid plan with dates, with specific areas of improvement and suggestions of how they do improve. And it should be signed by the employee, and it goes into the personnel file. It's their short-term goals. Now, kind of like putting them on probation. There's no real thing as probation in public employment, but it's similar to that because they're on notice that if they don't improve, that these consequences could follow. So it's just something a little bit more formal, and it's a little bit more specific so that the employee knows what to expect and what they need to do to improve. In the context of a union contract, this might be a last chance agreement kind of thing, similar to that. So the purpose really is to make sure that the employee knows what the problem is and how to improve, and the consequences of not improving. All right, imposing discipline. All right, so we discussed briefly that the fact that once a person has completed their probationary period, they have a legitimate or a property right interest in their job so that they can only be disciplined or terminated for just cause. Now, and this is actually very similar to what the contract provision is in a labor contract. Because once a person becomes a member of the union, that's the same standard that's going to apply. So what is just cause? Well, there's no standardized definition of what just cause is. But it has a couple of different elements that you need to be aware of. It requires that there's a reasonable work rule or policy or practice, and that the policy, rule, or practice is known to the employee, and then the employee doesn't comply with those rules or those practices. It requires that there be an investigation that's fair with the opportunity to be heard, and then equal treatment with other employees if discipline does occur. We're helped a little bit because the personnel policy and the collective bargaining agreements both specify examples of what would constitute just cause. Usually it's things like theft or conviction of a crime or insubordination. And there's a whole list that's in your personnel policy. You can take a look at that. And then there's generally the other category of any other action that reflects poorly on the city of Old Town. So it's a non-exhaustive list, but it gives you an idea of things that are inappropriate. And generally in context, you're probably going to be looking at things like insubordination or violation of written policies or even poor performance can be basis for a disciplinary action.
So would that be where public social media might come in if they're on their Facebook account trashing their employment and all that, or is that just an opinion?
That's a good question, and the answer is that public employees do not check their First Amendment rights at the door. However, that doesn't mean that a public employee can speak from their job position on behalf of the city and not get in trouble for it. So if you want to go and get up at a council meeting and say, and talk about a matter of public concern as a citizen, even if you disagree with the city council, you can perfectly well do that. But if you get up as director of public works and say, well, I disagree with your policy because as director of public works, I think that, the roads ought to be plowed, within 12 hours or something like that. And that's not protected speech. So you post that kind of thing on social media, or you say it in person to the council, that could get you into trouble. So it is a bit of a tricky question. And if you've got any questions about speech from an employee and whether that qualifies, then you might want to just call us to talk it through. Because the consequences of displaying the wrong type of speech, you can get into deep trouble for that.
And social media can get tricky because employees, I believe, under the Maine Labor Relations Act. Is that pretty analogous to the National Labor Relations Act in terms of protected concerted activity?
Yes and no. It's a little bit different. So there's no equivalent provision of that Section 7.
So call us. I'll omit my comment and just call us if you have a question about what to do with an employee's social media post.
But they don't need to have an equivalent provision because they are still subject to, the First Amendment. So it's out there. There's something that protects speech. You just got to make sure you know what kind of speech it is. So it can be confusing.
It's funny who determines that.
In the end, the judge.
Right, judge and jury, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that could be too. That's a whole different venue. We talked about the Maine Human Rights Commission, but there's also the Labor Relations Commission, the Labor Relations Board, and if the employer takes certain actions and the union wants to file a prohibited practice complaint about union issues, then they can do that, and you're going to go litigation down that road as well.
What if you generate that speech while on the job? On your social post?
Or if you do your social post that has nothing to do,
Yes.
then you can be certified. You can be cited for wasting time.
All right.
You're not working, you're supposed to be working. If you do it on your break, that's fine, but if you do it while you're supposed to be working, that's a problem. If you're texting while you're driving the snowplow, that's a problem.
You're right, that would be. You ever drove one of them things?
I jumped out of
It's hard enough just to drive it. No multitasking, no.
All right. So it's important that you know your rules. That's the first place. If you are looking at an employee and you're going to perhaps discipline them for something, be familiar with the collective bargaining agreement or the city personnel rules, because they will tell you specifically how things go. Generally, it's going to be a very similar process. If something comes to your attention that may require discipline, the first thing that you want to do is you want to do some sort of background investigation to make sure that the complaint or that the problem that's been reported to you is valid. If you're dealing with something like a sexual harassment complaint, then your investigation is going to be far more formal and exhaustive. If you are investigating whether a person, you know, was driving inappropriately and ran through a red light or something like that, then you're probably having a different level of investigation. But either way, when information comes to you, you need to do some sort of investigation to make sure that the initial information is correct or at least credible. You know, if you're the supervisor and you witnessed it personally, that makes it a lot easier, but a lot of the times it's going to come to you through a third person. So I'm going to talk about the elements of a more formal investigation, and just know that depending upon the situation, you may not have to have it quite as formal as I'm talking about here. So generally, if there's a complaint that comes into you as a supervisor, you're going to want to talk to the complainant to find out exactly what the problem is. If this is a human rights complaint type or a discrimination type of complaint, then you want to make sure that it's pretty confidential, get the person away from the rest of the population, find out what it is they're complaining about, get all the details down, and that will be the starting place for your investigation. From there, you're going to want to go and talk to the person complained about, the complainee, and let them know that, gee, I've received this complaint about you, and I need to hear some background from you about what's going on here. And by the way, there's a absolute prohibition against any kind of retaliation. And make sure that that's very clear from the beginning. You may need to go and separate the people. So if you're talking about co-employees that would normally work together, then you may need to reassign the complainee temporarily to make sure that there's no continuing harm that's occurred. If it's a very serious case, you may put the person being investigated on paid administrative leave to give you that time to do that investigation. And under your personnel board rules, your policy, you can put a person on paid administrative leave for 3 days to conduct your investigation. And it can be longer with the city manager's approval. That's not considered discipline. You're still getting paid. Just gives you the time to do that investigation. You're going to want to ask the people involved, who do you think I should be talking to about this? Who has information about the incident? And it may be just that it's those two. They were in the room drinking coffee, and Valerie starts winking at John, and you know how that goes. Or it could be something that's been pervasive throughout the workplace. This pattern of inappropriate behavior is alleged, and then you may need to be interviewing a whole bunch of different people to get a full story done. And these interviews are going to be done one-on-one, so the person can speak fairly anonymously. You want to make sure that they feel comfortable and they're advised of the no retaliation requirements as well. You may need to, normally it's going to be the supervisor that's going to do the investigation. Depending upon if you've got other people in the organization, you may have to bump it up and have a third person do the investigation. If it's a sexual harassment claim, you may need to accommodate the people involved and have the investigator be of the appropriate gender to allow people to express their feelings more easily. And there may be times when it's such a big issue that you may need to go and hire an outside person to come in and conduct an investigation. I've seen public entities do that on multiple occasions. They'll hire an outside attorney to come in and do a neutral evaluation of the facts and just report back with the facts so that the management can decide whether there's been a basis for discipline or not. All right, so once the investigation's been wrapped up, then you have some basic facts, and then you have to decide whether there's enough information there to even proceed with a disciplinary hearing. If you decide that the information, there's nothing to it, then you can just close it up right there, and everyone just goes on about their business. But if there's enough of an allegation there that warrants an actual hearing, then you go on to the next step. So a disciplinary hearing is really a two-step process. The first thing you want to do is find out whether there's been a violation of policy, rule, or practice. So that's your first step. You don't have to worry about what the remedy is. At this point, you just want to say, is there a violation? So you've got a bunch of facts. You're going to call in the individual who's being accused of having done whatever the person supposedly did. You're going to give them the opportunity to respond to all the allegations made against them. You're going to give them sufficient notice that you're going to have this hearing. And so this first handout that I'm going to pass around is just a basic template you can use for to notify a person that they're being asked to attend this disciplinary hearing. As you will see, it's pretty straightforward. It says that the information has come to the management's attention that you may have violated a policy. This is the policy that you are alleged to have potentially violated. You are directed to report to a hearing, and you can bring someone along with you to represent you, whether that's the attorney or a shop steward or union person, that's fine. So this is simply to notify the person that this proceeding is going to take place. I believe under your contracts and personal ordinance, it's a 3-day minimum if it's a serious case. But you need to give the person sufficient time to be able to review the information and come up with a defense. All right, the second phase of a disciplinary hearing, if you find that there is a violation, then the second phase is to decide what's the appropriate remedy. How are you going to handle it? What's the sanction that's going to be imposed? And that's where you're going to take a larger view of the person's background. Are there any mitigating circumstances? Are there any aggravating circumstances? What's the person's work history? Is there any recent related discipline? Has the person been a long-time employee with a stellar past? Is the person remorseful? Are they taking responsibility for their act? Are they promising to do better? Things like that. And based on all those factors, then you can decide what the appropriate remedy is. So the important thing is that you're breaking up the two. The first question is there a violation? And the second question is kind of like almost a separate hearing to decide what the appropriate way to proceed is. Now, in terms of actually handling the hearing itself, the amount of hearing that you provide, the formality of the hearing depends really on the offense. If it's a simple first-time offense, the person is accused of violating a minor infraction of city policy, then your hearing is really going to be just basically saying to the person, what's your side of the story? And it probably doesn't need to be much more than that. The opportunity to be heard can be a very informal thing. Now, on the other hand, if you've got a person who's up perhaps for termination, and it's a major violation, then you're going to have people come in as witnesses, and you're going to give them a full type of hearing where the witnesses will be brought in, documents might be submitted, and it's going to be very, very formalistic.
Does this all go on your personal file, Say,
if an investigation about you is done,
yeah.
then yes, it's going to be put in your file. The investigation itself may be just a factual investigation. It may be that it's found that there's no violation. So that's going to end right there. It'll be in your file because it relates to your performance and so forth, but it's not going to really have any purpose. It's just one of those documents you need to keep in place. If discipline is issued, then that material is still going to be retained. The final discipline is going to be considered a public document. All of the investigation materials will not be. So, and we've seen this in Penobscot County with the Bangor Daily News asking for employees' final discipline. And those are all public records. And provided something like the Bangor Daily News asks for it, then there's no basis for retraining them. But all the investigation materials, all the other stuff leading up to it, that would still be confidential. Part of your personal file, but confidential. All right, so I think I've gone off the rails a little bit here.
Is this considered your Loudermill, is this your Loudermill hearing?
It can be.
Could be, okay.
Loudermill,
Process here.
yeah, Loudermill hearing is really just a pre-termination hearing.
Sure,
And a pre-termination hearing is just one of these hearings, but more formal.
sure.
It's really a matter of spectrum, from the very informal hearing for a simple, maybe oral reprimand might result versus termination.
Okay.
All right, so whatever type of discipline is issued, it needs to be documented in the personal file. I don't think I need to say that, but if something is called an oral reprimand, it still has to have a memo in the file to show that it exists and that it was given. All right. So the procedures for discipline, not including termination, are a lot simpler. When you do get into a situation where an employee might be terminated, you need to let them know that in advance. And whereas the supervisor might be conducting the disciplinary hearing for, I want to call standardized discipline, the city manager is going to be conducting the pre-termination hearing. Things will be far more formalistic, and it'll be his decision to whether to issue discipline or not. The supervisor in that case will probably just give a memo and a recommendation to the city manager, and then the city manager will hold the hearing, go from there. Once discipline has been issued, it's not necessarily the end of the story. Under the personnel policy, that can be appealed. First person issuing discipline might be a supervisor, and then from there, it could be appealed to a personnel board composed of a variety of different people. So it can basically be grieved to that second step. The ordinance, I keep calling it an ordinance, because the city of Ellsworth has a personnel ordinance instead of a personnel policy. I do a lot of work with that. So the personnel policy specifies who is going to be on that committee. There's a member of the city who is not involved. There's an employee that's been appointed by the person who received discipline. And then there's a third person from outside of the city who's called in with HR background. So this is a committee that will hear the grievance if it's on the city side. If you're in a collective bargaining agreement, you're going to be looking at arbitration instead. It will be appealed to the city council, and then the grievance process, right? It's also the grievance process, and then that can go to arbitration if necessary. In the end, appeals from, or grievances from city discipline can end up in Superior Court under Rule 80B appeal, which is very difficult to prevail upon. And under the collective bargaining agreements, you're going to end up in arbitration before, I think this city uses AAA. So they're similar procedures, but you'll end up in different places.
Not the car company.
All right. I got turned around and where I was talking. Quick look at my notes. In the meantime, if you guys have anything you want to add, I'll give it time.
Josh, why don't you talk about some general considerations?
Sure. So, I'm just going to go over some general thoughts and whatnot. Like Frank touched on earlier, the big thing from our perspective is that discipline, and especially termination, should never be a surprise. If somebody is at that point where they're getting written up, or they're getting let go, they should know it's coming, either because there's been a history there and it's in the file, or they do something that is just so bad that anybody would know, I just crashed through the front window in City Hall and they get in trouble for this, something to that level. When you get surprises is when people start wondering, well, maybe there's something else going on here. Maybe there's another reason why I'm getting in trouble. What could it be? Maybe it's A, B, or C, protected status. Written communications, I want to talk on those for a minute, especially as supervisors. when you are writing anything to an employee or to your fellow supervisors or even bosses relating to employees or discipline or what's going on, just be mindful about how your communication would look if it ever winds up in front of a judge or an arbitrator or a jury, because something might seem okay to you in one context, but if, let's say, an employee wants to talk to you about a concern that they have, you respond, "We can talk about this in the morning," period. That reads a lot differently than, "We can talk about this in the morning, 7 exclamation points." Things like that can make a difference in how it looks. And sometimes that can matter. So just kind of be mindful about how you're wording things, punctuation. You want it to look good. You don't want to be embarrassed if a jury of 8 or 9 or maybe 12 people are taking a look at what you've written. Emojis. Please don't use emojis. I would say that as supervisors, you probably ought not to be communicating with your subordinates by text message anyway. If you're going to, keep it very, very limited, only to business necessity. But under no means should you be using emojis. They can get you in trouble because there can be a lot of ambiguities in what an emoji means. A wink could mean I'm joking in one situation. It could mean something flirtatious in another. And again, that's something that a jury or judge might be looking at after the fact, trying to figure out, what does this mean? So just stay away from it.
Means I got something in my eye. Did you see the emoji?
It could be.
Something in his eye.
Yeah. So that's something we don't want to have to try to explain after the fact. So just be careful about how things look. If you're at the point of having a discussion with an employee that's going to have to be let go, and this is probably more relevant to the at-will employees who are still within that 6-month probationary period, because if you're dealing with unionized employees, you've probably gone through the grievance process by that point. Hopefully, you should have if you didn't, that John's already described. If you're talking about longer-term city employees who have a property interest, you've gone through some of those more detailed procedures, but especially when you're dealing with the probationary period, 6 months or less, you're sitting down to kind of have the final goodbye with them. Here are my thoughts on how this conversation should go. It is not a time for debate. If you've reached the point where somebody needs to be let go, the decision has been made, you're not going to gain anything productive by engaging in a debate with that person about, geez, what if maybe I can do this, or maybe that's not true, maybe you're just being unduly harsh with me, would you reconsider, maybe give me another chance. The ship has sailed by that point in time, so try not to get into a debate, just keep it short, to the point, and look, this is the decision, I'm sorry, but this is the decision and this is what we're going with, okay? When you give them the reason for why they are being let go, you want to make sure that it's the same reason that you're going to want to tell the judge or the jury or the arbitrator a year down the road if they file a lawsuit or a complaint. Because if the story changes, you're going to look bad. So other circumstances where I've seen this is because kind of like with the performance reviews, you want to be the nice guy, you want to soft pedal things. Geez, Billy Bob, I'm really sorry. I like you a lot, but we're downsizing or we're eliminating the position and we just don't need you anymore. That's why we're going to let you go. That's how the conversation goes. In reality, it's he's a terrible employee and I can't stand him anymore and I need to get rid of him. But I don't want to be mean and tell him that. So, okay, so that's how the conversation goes. We're not filling this position anymore. What happens a month down the road if he sees that job being posted, okay? Or he hears from a friend that the city is looking to fill a position or whatever. He's going to have a lot of questions at that point. And maybe he finds a lawyer, maybe they file a lawsuit, and then you're going to be in the untenable position of saying, well, I know I told him that when I let him go, but that was a lie, and here's the real reason. Don't go there. If you're going to give a reason, make sure that it's the truth. You can be polite about it, but be truthful. You should let the person know where they stand. If there's somebody that's gonna be eligible for rehire, or maybe if they'd be better fit for another position that the city has an opening for, you can let them know that. If they ask, am I eligible for rehire, and the answer is no, you should let them know that. Again, just so that you're being truthful and honest with them. Here's an important one. If they have city property, get it before they leave at the end of their last day. Keys, key cards, passwords for computers, usernames, that sort of thing. It's a lot easier to get it before they leave than it is to call them up 2 weeks later and ask them for it. You're going to do a lot more chasing them around to get it. So that's a little one that people sometimes overlook. Get it before they leave. There are a couple final things that I'll talk about that Frank hinted at earlier that employees may request. Again, I suspect you may see this more often with people who haven't gone through more formal procedures. But in theory, anybody could do this. One is a request for a written reason for the termination. So if you're having that sit-down talk, if you don't want to tell somebody why you're letting them go, at that point in time, you're not under an obligation to do so in the at-will context, not so with the unionized or the property interest people. But if somebody specifically asks, I want a written statement for the reasons for my termination, there is a statute that says you have to give that to them within 15 days. So just be mindful of that, that if somebody does make a request for that, you make note of it and you let the HR or the appropriate person know so that they can make sure the response gets out on time. And then there's another statute that says every employee has a right to get a copy of their personnel file for free at least once a year. They can get it more often than that if they want to pay for it. But this is an interesting statute because I find a lot of people have a very narrow view in their mind of what a personnel file is. So it's a manila folder that we keep in HR in the cabinet, filing cabinet that has these 10 documents and that's it. And if it's not in the personnel file, then it's not personnel material. Well, that's not what the statute says, and that's not how the Maine Law Court, which is the Supreme Judicial Court, has interpreted it. This is the definition of what actually counts as personnel file. It's pretty broad. Any formal or informal employee evaluations and reports relating to the employee's character, credit, work habits, compensation and benefits, and non-privileged medical records or nurses' station notes which the employer has in its possession. Also, investigation materials into investigations of the employee. So those types of things, to the extent that they exist and you have them, count as personnel file materials. So just be mindful of that. If they're in your desk drawer and not in the personnel file, they're still part of the personnel materials that the employee is entitled to. So just be wary of that. And it also includes emails. So if you're emailing between supervisors or between departments that, this employee is doing a great job. They have a great character and work history. That's an employee personnel material. The converse of that is also true. This person is terrible, and they've been late 17 times, and they're just not getting it. That counts as a personnel file material as well. So just like I said, keep that in the back of your mind that those things count, regardless of where you keep them. So if you get such a request, make sure that you're going into your desk drawer, into your emails, whatever the case may be, to make sure that you get anything that fits that definition. And we can certainly help with that process if the city has any questions about it. But putting that out there just to put it on your radar.
And also all those good emails that come in from citizens saying how great you've done.
Yeah, that's right.
Those are reports concerning your conduct too. So finally, just to follow up on what Josh said, if there's a dispute, the first thing that the city will get is a letter from a lawyer that says that's basically what's called a litigation hold, which is to say, I request that you retain and not destroy every electronically stored piece of information about the employee who has departed. And that imposes on each of you as supervisors an obligation to make sure that happens. And that includes text messages to or from the employee, depending on, no matter whose phone they're on, if they're on someone in the city supervision, emails, digitally created records of all kinds. And the problem is if those things get destroyed or deleted automatically because of some deletion system or somebody changed phones, then there's an inference that can arise that what they contained was harmful to the city. So be aware in the current environment that this digital stuff, even very informal, can be quite important to retain and make sure that someone at City Hall has got a copy of it. So the other issue that comes up at the end of the employment is to make sure people get paid fully. They need to get paid fully and promptly. If they don't, the city can end up owing 3 times the wages plus attorney's fees. So if there's any question about somebody's final pay, take it up promptly and get it addressed. So what I want to end with, I think, is there are different definitions that labor arbitrators use for just cause. And not all of them use this strict standard, but there's a strict 7-part standard that some use. And I think in the sense that it's the gold standard, you probably ought to just hear what it is. So the 7 questions of just cause are, did the city give forewarning or foreknowledge of the possible or probable disciplinary consequences of the employee's conduct? I have to say yes. Was the city's rule reasonably related to the orderly, efficient, and safe operation of city business? 3, did the city, before it administered discipline, make an effort to discover whether the employee did in fact violate or disobey the rule or the order? Number 4, was the city's investigation conducted fairly and objectively? Number 5, in the investigation, did the decision maker get substantial evidence that proved that the employee was guilty as charged? 6, has the city applied its rules and orders and penalties even-handedly and without discrimination to all employees? And 7, was the degree of discipline administered by the city reasonably related to A, the seriousness of the employee's proven offense, and B, the record of that employee in their service to the city? That's the highest level. That's the level we should all aspire to if you're going to have to take the unfortunate step of termination and discipline. Any questions about any of that? Happy to discuss it. We appreciate your attention to all of this. I hope it's been valuable and useful for you. And, look forward to working with you all in the future. When one member of our team or other, I may retire, but the others will.
Thank you. Is that foreshadowing? Thank you very much for coming and talking to us today on these topics. I'm sure if we have any questions, we can get them to the department heads and we can get them through to Frank or one of the other ones. And appreciate your time. We'll shut that off. Department heads, please don't leave for a second. We're going to give you something for wellness to take back to your departments. You may want, if you got a big department, you may want help.
No problem. No, they're all.
This item negotiated already. Is it substantial?
Yeah.